Chapter 511. As he spoke, he slowly stepped back. Since you're here, you have something you want to do. You're no longer the Red Lady of the past. The grudges between us should be written off. I congratulate you for finally becoming a dragons. Since we're dragons, you and I are blood relatives. Then I'll take my leave. At this moment, Red Lady slowly put her hand into the door and stopped moving as if she had caught something. Her eyes were also focused on the void in front of her, looking very focused. But after listening to Li Yunxin's words, she smiled slightly. Don't go. You should know that with my current cultivation level, you can't leave even if you want to. Li Yunxin. Red Lady used to love you and wanted to help you. And now I'm going to help you as well. In the past, you were in my heart and I could come and go as I pleased. Now I can't do that again. The thing I came to Mount Shaoyin to get is probably what you want. But since Red Lady loves you, I thought there are many treasures in this Mount Shaoyin, but I'll only take one. As for the rest, I'll give them to you as long as you like them. This is my good intention, you can't not appreciate it. Speaking of this, she turned her face slightly to look at Li Yunxin. If you don't appreciate it, I'll kill you. No one in the world will be able to appreciate your kindness. After finishing her words, she suddenly pulled her hand backward. At this moment, the two red dots on her forehead suddenly expanded and suddenly turned into a pair of shining dragon horns. But the dragon horns only appeared for a moment. They quickly shrank back. But at this moment it was already done. Suddenly, a large amount of mysterious light burst out from the door of Chen Hall, as if there were countless electric snakes swimming, thunder roaring, and fire clouds rolling. The appearance of a restrictive spell appeared outside the entire palace. Countless gods and heavenly generals were densely guarding the eaves and ridges of the palace, forming a formation together. But now they disappeared in a flash, just like the two light horns on Red Lady's forehead. Because of Red Lady's sudden tug, the figures of these gods suddenly shattered and turned into streams of light that filled the entire world before exploding. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. In the next moment, Red Lady slowly lowered her hands and walked into the Chen Palace Hall. The restriction that Li Yunxin and Su Sheng couldn't do anything about was broken by her claw. She took 5 steps inside and was sure that everything was all right. She then turned around and looked at Li Yunxin. What are you waiting for instead of coming in to retrieve the treasure? Li Yunxin looked at her expressionlessly. After about a dozen breaths of time, he suddenly said in a low voice, You said you also wanted something. Let me think. The thing you want is that legendary treasure, right? According to the legends, if one obtains it, they will become the lord of the demons of the world. As he spoke, Bai Yunxin slowly retreated. Yao knew how to adapt to circumstances. Listening to Red Madam's words, he realized that he had also been intentionally or unintentionally plotted against. Now that Red Lady and Li Yunxin were entangled, there was nothing she could do. He also saw that the fish spirit's temperament had changed greatly. Who knew if she would be a friend or foe in a while? He might as well sneak away as soon as possible and make plans later. Hearing Li Yunxin's words, Red Madam laughed and said, Exactly. I only want that one thing. In the end, Li Lang only wants to live in seclusion, so this thing is not something that you must obtain, right? After saying this, she continued, Where is Sister Bai going? Could he bear to leave just like that? In Manwan Mountain, I heard you tell Li Lang that you like him. Bai Yunxin's expression froze and she stopped in her tracks. Only then did Red Madam turn her face toward her and said, Since you like me, then you should go. Why don't you ask him today if he likes you too? If you like it too and the two of you love each other? Bai Yunxin took 2 deep breaths and finally raised her thin eyebrows. Li Xinyu? Don't push me too far. Red Madam blinked her eyes. Ha! Now that you have the dragon soul, I really can't do anything to you. Bai Yunxin looked at her. However, compared to the demoness in the past, her face was indeed filled with anger, which was rarely seen on her face. But have I ever mistreated you? When I took you away from Dongting, I should have sent you to my adoptive father and killed you to get the dragon soul to unlock his seal. But no matter what the reason was, I didn't send you there, but wanted to take you away from here, didn't I? Did I do anything wrong to you? Why did you humiliate me like this today? Red Madam smiled slightly and thought for a while. It seems that you didn't do anything wrong. Bai Yunxin glared at her again. I also advise you not to think that you are invincible in the world now. What about my adoptive father in the past and what about now? Do you think that you are invincible with brute force? Now let me tell you, my mother has sent me a message a few days ago. Demons are determined to conquer Mount Yinshan. They want to conquer Mount Yinshan and directly destroy its lair. They won't retreat after killing some Taoists. Now the war should have started. Maybe in a few hours Mount Yunshan may be conquered. At that time, do you still want to be so arrogant in front of so many monster kings, dragon son? Hearing what she said, Li Yunxin was not surprised. He was a little surprised, because Bai Yunxin mentioned the word mother. She actually has a mother? It seems that she is still alive and has a high position in the allied forces of monsters and demons. But she thought that her so-called mother was long gone. The marriage between demons and demons is different from that of mortals. For example, if a crane monster and a fox monster get married, the fox monster will die after giving birth to the fetus. Because if it is not a marriage between demons of the same species, but a marriage between different species, the demon power of the fetus will clash with the demon power of the mother. During pregnancy, the mother will become weaker day by day. When this demon fetus grows up and is born, it will be the time for the mother to die. Bai Yunxin is a true realm great demon. If she had been born, and her mother was still alive, did that mean that she had married into the same clan? But, in this world, are there two other crane monsters that are strong enough to give birth to a true realm crane monster that Li Yunxin has heard of? Li Yunxin does not know if he is ignorant or not. But with his current knowledge and experience, he had indeed never heard of two crane demons whose cultivation was so high that they could participate in the decision-making process of the dragon sons. Hearing her words, Red Madam also raised her eyebrows. Oh? So tell me, who is Sister Bai's mother? Bai Yunxin narrowed her eyes. I am just telling you. You can care about the matter between you and Li Yunxin. But don't provoke me. Whether I like him or not, it is my business. I don't need other people to decide, and I don't need you to decide. If you are smart and tactful, don't waste time here with me. If you insist on making life difficult for me, no matter what kind of friendship we have in the past, I, Bai Yunxin, am not you in the past. After saying this, she turned around and walked away, completely ignoring Red Madam and Li Yunxin. Just like that, she took 3 steps. Red Madam looked at her in silence. When she took the 4th step, Red Madam suddenly raised her hand, and something flew out from her sleeve. Li Yunxin was startled and shouted in a low voice, "Be careful." Bai Yunxin also seemed to be prepared. She turned around and flipped her palms, and 2 small treasures flew out from her sleeves. They looked like 2 small silver swords. Immediately, they interweaved into a dense net of mysterious light in front of her, and blocked that thing. But there was no earth-shaking sound, and there was no violent surging of spiritual power. A piece of clothing fell on the ground. This piece of clothing was snow white. There were no gaps or traces of stitching, and it looked like it was made by nature. There were countless small and slightly shining feather patterns on it. They looked like feather patterns but also like scales. Seeing this thing, Li Yunxin was stunned. Bai Yunxin, on the other hand, was dumbfounded. Red Madam smiled. It seems that Brother Li is also worried about Sister Bai. So, you two have some friendship. After saying this, she walked to the front of the cabinet in the Qian Palace Hall and opened it one by one like a secular person opening a cabinet. It seemed that she was looking for the thing that could make her the ruler of the demons if she obtained it. While looking at it, she said softly, "This is your feather clothes. My father took it back for you and now I return it to you. From now on, we don't owe each other anything." Bai Yunxin stared at the clothes that she stopped and hit on the ground in disbelief. After a full 3 breaths, she suddenly stepped forward, picked it up, and hugged it tightly in her arms. A very complicated expression appeared on her face. And this was the first time Li Yunxin saw such an expression on the face of this crane demon. It was indescribable excitement, surprise, and gratitude. Feather clothes? The reason why Li Yunxin was slightly surprised was also because he had heard of this thing. It was after he killed the 9th young master, and when he first met the Lord Dongting on Mount Lord Dongting. At that time he made up a reason, saying that Bai Yunxin and Lu Ling fought because Lu Ling had the treasure that Bai Yunxin wanted. Unexpectedly, by a stroke of luck, the Lord Dongting thought for a while, and then helped him make up a lie. Or it should be the feather clothes. He also said that the crane demon Bai Yunxin had a feather clothes, which was necessary for her to enter this mortal world and the world where the golden rock was sealed. However, 1,000 years ago it was forcefully taken by a Taoist priest surnamed Niu, so in the past 1,000 years she had to go to the celestial sect several times to ask for it back, but to no avail. And at that time, Lu Ling did wear Bai Yunxin's feather clothes. When Lu Ling and the 9th young master fought, the feather clothes and several magic treasures were taken by the 9th young master. After the 9th young master died, those magic treasures were left in his temporary imperial residence. The temporary imperial residence of the demons had always been very secretive. If anyone could find it, it could only be the great demon near the Wei River, the Lord Dongting. So later the feather clothes and many other treasures passed through the hands of the Lord Dongting, and now it was brought out by Hong Niu. Such an item which should have belonged to Bai Yunxin had changed hands many times, but she always missed it. But today, it was actually thrown back by Hong Niu. It should be extremely important to Bai Yunxin. So this female demon immediately showed such an expression. Bai Yunxin stared at Hong Niu for a while, then turned to look at Li Yunxin. She seemed to want to say something, but in the end she didn't. After a long silence she said, "Okay, Li Xinyu, I have received your kindness. But my words are also true. In a few hours the situation may change greatly. The two of you, take care of yourselves." After saying that, he didn't look at Li Yunxin again and flew away. Li Yunxin also didn't say anything. Until Bai Yunxin's figure disappeared in the ruins of the group of halls, he suddenly smiled and walked into the Qian Hall. He also walked into the Qian Hall, shaking his head slightly as he walked. This is a good move. It's almost an overt plot. Since you have spent so much effort, fine. I am not a bashful person, so I will also accept your kindness. You find your treasure, I will take mine. You really found that treasure, just open my eyes. After saying that, he crossed the threshold and stepped into the Qian Hall. Su Sheng stood in front of the hall door, blinked his eyes and said slowly, "The silver soul tail ring should be in the mysterious number 36 cabinet. She has already opened it, you can go and take the treasure." After saying that, he smiled again. "Alas, you this person. Do you have integrity or no integrity? Strange. Li Yunxin snorted, "None of your business." Chapter 512. After finding the silver soul tail ring in the mysterious cabinet 36 that Su Sheng mentioned, Li Yunxin gave it a try. In reality, it only looked like a silver thread as thin as a strand of hair. It floated in the cabinet, surrounded by a dim ring of light. Li Yunxin took it and put it on the pinky finger of his left hand. The silver thread immediately sank into his flesh and nothing could be seen. This kind of thing was not like other treasures that required profound incantations to be used. Since he had practiced Taoist magic, it was easy for him to use it. He knew that this thing was similar to the temporary Imperial Palace and the Dragon Palace, but also very different. The temporary Imperial Palace was a real world, but the inside of this thing was nothingness. When you put a treasure inside, the treasure was not actually inside the ring. According to mortals, it should be in a state of both in place and in the ring. For example, he was using this ring to quickly store all the treasures in the cabinet. In reality, those treasures were still in the place where Li Yunxin had stored them. However, the ring had taken that place away. If he brought the ring to the capital of the Qin kingdom, then it would be like, the treasures were still in Mount Shaoyun, but the space on Mount Shaoyun where the treasures were stored had been taken by Li Yunxin to the capital. In reality, all treasures that could store items in the world of cultivation followed the same principle. It could not be considered truly stored, but only a method, or way. If someone could really refine a treasure like the demon's temporary imperial palace, then in the eyes of cultivators, it could be called a rare treasure. In this way he only spent a quarter of an hour to collect most of the treasures in the Qian Hall. Just as Su Sheng said, there were many treasures that the ring could not store. According to Su Sheng, these types of treasures were mostly armors. Because they were too sharp, their killing intent was too heavy. Thus, they were like people difficult to control. But even if they could not store them, they still wanted to take them away. Li Yunxin simply put them all on. He wore a 9 8 golden leaf dragon scale armor and a flaming lion purple gold crown on his head. On his feet was a pair of 6-petaled beast claw boots, and on his waist was a 6-foot golden goose feather saber. Wearing these treasures in the eyes of ordinary people, they looked extremely mighty and handsome. If someone were to appear on the battlefield wearing such clothes, they would definitely attract a large wave of arrows. But in the eyes of a cultivator, it was too exaggerated. It was unknown which sage came up with these things. However, most magic treasures could be refined into the body. He put it on, refined it, and disappeared with a thought. He would only summon it in times of war. Seeing him dressed like this, Su Sheng smiled slowly. While praising the magnificence of his armor, she told him in detail about its origins. But how could Li Yunxin be patient enough to listen? He was currently picking up some of the remaining treasures that he fancied and equipping them all. Layers upon layers of weapons hung around his waist, all of them refined. As for the other armors, they were also refined. Ordinary cultivators could not do this, but demons could. Because on the path of cultivation, if a demon gained intelligence and entered the door compared to a human, it was really hard to say which one was the wisest of all. For example, when Li Yunxin was in the city of Wei, The spiritual power in his ocean of qi and mountain of snow was sealed, so he took the risk and absorbed people's power of faith. Who knew that it would lead to a disaster, almost causing his ocean of qi and mountain of snow to collapse and his body to die. This was because human cultivators could only use the spiritual energy in the world. Regardless of whether it was the cultivation orthodoxy, the sword sex cultivation technique, or the painting paths cultivation technique, they all used the spiritual energy in this world. If the spiritual energy was pure, the spiritual power in the cultivator's body would also be pure. Since it was pure, the power of the sword would be great. Compared to the demons, this was an advantage. And the so-called demon power of the demons was actually the power in the demon's body. For example, demons like the Golden Rock King who cultivated Tao. He first transformed into a human, imitating a human's meridians, ocean of qi and mountain of snow. Then, like a human cultivator, he absorbed spiritual energy from the world and refined it into spiritual power in his body. This spiritual power was called spiritual power in the cultivator's body, but in the demon's body, it was called demon power. Because the power in the demon's body was really mixed. He could cultivate Tao and use spiritual power. He could also enjoy incense and use the power of faith. Even like what Li Yunxin did, he could refine souls and absorb grievances. Because the so-called human body of a demon was essentially a mimicry. Even the ocean of qi and mountain of snow was imitated, so there was no need to worry about the chaotic flow of energy in the body. Before the demon gained intelligence and could transform into a human, the meridians of a human were naturally good for cultivation. In reality, this was because all the cultivation methods were created by humans, or customized for humans, so naturally it was suitable. But when the demon could also imitate the ocean of qi and mountain of snow and mountain of qi and meridians, it was hard to say who was more gifted on the path of cultivation. Maybe it was because of this that the Xianmen had been guarding against the cultivation methods for tens of thousands of years, so that the demon could only rely on the supernatural power and physical body. Also, the reason why Li Yunxin could refine many treasures into his body was because of the strong physical body of the dragons. The other reason was that the demon didn't worry about the chaotic flow of energy in the body. It was not easy for human cultivators to do this, but not for the demon. He was finally satisfied after plundering, and then he saw Red Lady standing at the door of the hall, looking at him without blinking. Li Yunxin coughed. "Did you find the thing?" Red Lady shook her head. "It's not here." Li Yunxin nodded and looked at Su Sheng. "According to the reincarnation of the Sage of Calligraphy, that thing probably doesn't exist. That Juanfu of yours must have been spreading false rumors." Red Lady blinked and looked at Su Sheng. "He is the Sage of Calligraphy?" It seemed that she didn't bother to ask before. Now that Li Yunxin said it, she knew the identity of this stupid person. But even so, she didn't sound too surprised. It was like talking about a passerby. "It's the reincarnation." Li Yunxin had a good impression of her attitude, at least compared with the past. He might also like burning emotions, but at least it was difficult for him to accept seemingly burning emotions. Red Lady didn't seem to know what the reincarnation was. But at least she knew that the reincarnation of the Sage of Calligraphy had a close relationship with the Sage of Calligraphy. So, she thought for a while and looked at Li Yunxin. "Do you also think that it's a rumor?" But without waiting for him to speak, she said, "My father said so. It is said that now those big demons also think that there is such a treasure in Cloud Mountain. Since you said it's the reincarnation of the Sage of Calligraphy, even he said it probably doesn't exist. So many powerful people can't be sure that it doesn't exist. Isn't it enough to explain the problem?" Her tone was concise and her logic was very clear. Compared to the previous Red Lady, she was as different as heaven and earth. Li Yunxin was speechless for a while after hearing what she said. He could only smile. Okay. It's up to you. Then you can continue to search in the Kuan Hall and the Qi Hall. Of course, I'm happy to take more treasures from you." After thinking for a while, he said, "But you look full of confidence. Do you know something else?" Red Lady was silent for a while. Then she said in a low voice, "I just thought of something else. That day you wanted to deceive my father, but you were tricked by him. You should know that although he is affectionate, his mind is not simple. I occasionally heard him talk about this treasure in Cloud Mountain, but I also thought it might be a rumor. But now I'm in Cloud Mountain, it's because of his scheme. He told me that he was going to look for the treasure after he left the small Cloud Mountain. If he wasn't sure that the treasure exists, why would he go through so much trouble to send me here?" Li Yunxin nodded. "What you said is reasonable. But nothing is absolute. In the eyes of outsiders, Zither monarch hatred started this war for the legendary treasure that can control all the demons, but in fact he has other intentions. You said that your father is very shrewd, maybe he also has other purposes, but you just didn't realize it. Red Lady listened to his words and became pensive. Li Yunxin smiled faintly, lifted her foot and walked out. But just as he stepped out of the door, he suddenly saw Red Lady smile. If I didn't know what kind of person you used to be, I would also believe you. But now that I think about it, I suspect that you also believe that the treasure exists after hearing me say so. Since he believed it and wanted it, he tried to persuade me to give up the idea. Tell me, do you have such intentions? Li Yunxin was slightly stunned and then sighed. If you like to think that way, then think that way. Changing a person's mind or impression is always the most difficult thing. If you don't believe me, pay more attention to me. You will know if I'm sincere or not. Red Lady slightly raised her eyebrows and stared at him for a while. Then she smiled. Of course I trust you the most. Let's go to the Kuan Hall now. The Qingkuan Hall and the Qingkuan Hall both stored magic treasures, but they were of different types. The treasures in the Qingkuan Hall were used to kill people, save people, and imprison people. Any one of them could be used to fight with people and was very powerful. But the word Kuan refers to earth and it was virtuous. The treasures in the Kuan Hall were much less sharp than those in the Qingkuan Hall. Therefore they weren't very interesting. For example, furnaces, cauldrons, books, paintings, and even some rare ancient books and some strange techniques. Just like before, Red Madam broke the prohibition effortlessly and entered the main hall with Li Yunxin to search carefully. In fact, if there really was that treasure, it should probably be here. Because the rest of the Qi halls mostly stored elixirs and heavenly treasures for alchemy. Therefore both Li Yunxin and Red Lady knew one thing. If that treasure really existed, there was only one possibility. It really existed. But only the person who spread the rumor knew what it was. However, that person mixed this thing with the other treasures of Cloudy Mountain. If she didn't say it, it would be very difficult for others to find it among so many treasures. But even so, it also meant that there was something different about that thing. Therefore, they all tried to distinguish which treasure it was among these treasures. But it was easier said than done. There were a total of 163 items and ancient books in the Kuan Hall. Excluding those that were obviously not in the range, there were still more than 40 items left. These 40 or so treasures couldn't be looked at and touched like ordinary objects, and one couldn't figure out the details of these treasures. After all, they were immortal treasures. There were still many mysterious things that needed to be carefully examined. Li Yunxin was very sensible and didn't compete with Red Lady. He had always been good at being flexible. Therefore he only guarded those that people didn't want, and slowly selected and put them into his ring. At the same time he looked at Red Lady. Now this Red Lady was full of vigor. Knowing that Su Sheng, who looked like a fool, was the reincarnation of the sage of calligraphy and seemed to have fallen for Li Yunxin's trick, he told Su Sheng everything he knew. Thus he took the treasures one by one and asked Su Sheng to tell him everything in detail. However, although Su Sheng was a sage, he was not in charge of the treasury. There were some things that he had often heard of, so he explained them to Red Lady. Red Lady thought carefully for a while and felt that they were not what she wanted, so she gave them to Li Yunxin. As for the others, Su Sheng didn't know what they were, so she also looked at them carefully. She kept the ones that she thought were possible, and gave the ones that were not possible to Li Yunxin. If there was one that Li Yunxin liked and felt that it was useful, he would say to her, "This thing is obviously something." Perhaps Red Madam would argue with him. But in the end she felt that what he said made sense, so she gave it to him. The three of them guarded the Kuan Hall, with a pile of immortal treasures around them. A perfectly good treasure trove had been turned into a secular market for reselling literature and playthings. Chapter 513. Another quarter of an hour passed. After picking and choosing, the treasures in Red Lady's hands became fewer and fewer. In the end there were only 5 things left. They were 3 scrolls, a token, and a wooden box. There were nearly 100 treasures that had been thrown away by Red Lady and taken away by Li Yunxin before. Even the most ordinary, one could tell that it was extraordinary when one looked at it and held it in one's hand. Only these 5 were the strangest. They looked really ordinary. If they weren't placed in the same compartment, people would think that they were the sundries accidentally left in this Kuan Hall for thousands of years. At this moment the 3 of them focused their attention on these 5 items. Red Lady was silent for a while, and then she reached out to pick up the first scroll in front of her. She was now sitting in front of a desk in the Kuan Hall. Su Sheng stood at the door and Li Yunxin was opposite her. So he watched Red Lady slowly unfold this thing. It was an 8-foot scroll. But it was not an ordinary 8-foot scroll, but 8 feet long and 8 feet wide. On the right side of the title, there were 5 words written neatly, Huangyu Jingtian map. When she saw these 5 words, Red Lady's eyes were already disappointed. Although she was a demon, Lord Dongting was not that kind of stupid demon who ate raw meat and drank blood. Red Lady was born as the princess of Dongting. Regardless of human experience in terms of poetry and literature, she might be above many scholars in the secular world. Therefore she knew that these 5 words meant that this was a map. Countries often used the Huangyu map to refer to the officially revised map. The word Jingtian was added to this map, which might mean that it was very different from the map drawn by mortals. This difference could be seen at a glance. Because of the surveying and mapping methods, the maps in the secular world were often distorted greatly. However, this picture looked extremely precise and orderly. The countries in the Midland were depicted in the map. But that was only a part of the total number of countries, about 36 countries. The mountains and rivers of each country were drawn in detail, and the names of each country, large and medium-sized cities, were also marked. This was the first time Li Yunxin saw a map in this world. Therefore, for the first time, he had a general and macroscopic understanding of the world he lived in. Although the map was blank on all 4 sides, which meant that there were more lands that had not been mapped and marked. However, it was big enough for him now. Because the map was 8 feet long and 8 feet wide, it was like a large double bed. And, from the moment he was born until now, the places he had been to only took up half the size of a palm on this map. Needless to say, the blank space outside the map represented an even wider space. It was impossible to draw such a large and accurate map in the secular world. Only cultivators could do it. To be exact, only the cultivators of Cloud Mountain could do it. This Cloud Mountain was walking in the sky of the Midland. Who else could be more gifted than the cultivators in the Cloud Mountain, and could draw high-precision maps? When Li Yunxin saw this, he couldn't help but stretch out his hand and touch the map. He wanted to confirm if there were any other mysteries in the painting. But there were none. It was just a map. Although the paper was impervious to fire and water, and the ink would never fade, there was no chi movement on it and no magic power. It was just a map. This made Li Yunxin stunned. But soon he smiled and realized that his previous background was not all his advantages. The reason why he touched the map was that if there were no other mysteries, why would a map be kept in the Kuan Palace? But soon after he realized that it was because he had seen too much, and now he was seeing too much. In his era, maps weren't rare and high-precision maps weren't rare either. As long as one wanted it, one could easily get it. But a long time ago, such as the current world high-precision maps, it would not be an exaggeration to say that they were national treasures or strategic resources. Once the generals got this map, they would know the direction of the mountains and rivers in the enemy country like the back of their hands. They could even accurately plan a place where they could march for a few days, and where to set up an ambush. However, the people of their own country didn't know much about the terrain of their country, and even the map was very different. It was like a man with eyes fighting a blind man. How could he not win? This map was a high-precision map of the 36 countries drawn by the cultivators on Mount Yinshan. For the people of this era, it was indeed a divine map that could only be made by extraordinary skills. Because of this, Red Lady was only disappointed when she saw this map, but she didn't feel strange. She looked at the map carefully and then looked at Li Yunxin. "What are you laughing at?" Li Yunxin shook his head. "I'm laughing at the fact that the cultivators of the Xianmen sect don't eat the food of the mortal world, but they still set up a station in every big city in the mortal world. They live on Mount Yinshan and look aloof, but in the end, they even drew such a map and hid it in the Kuan Palace like a treasure. It can be seen that they are not as aloof as they say. Little Su, tell me," he turned his face and looked at Su Sheng playfully, "are you planning to take this map to the secular world to fight for the world if you can't cultivate it anymore?" Su Sheng blinked his eyes. It's not, that's it. This map, in fact, in the past," Li Yunxin sighed and waved his hand. Okay. Don't say it. When I hear you speak so slowly, I'm so anxious that I want to say it for you." Red Lady listened to Li Yunxin ridicule Su Sheng. Her gaze stayed on the map for a while. After thinking for a dozen breaths of time, he finally rolled up the painting. She didn't hand it to Li Yunxin but just put it aside and took the second one. "Look at this one." This scroll was much more mystical than the Huangyu Heaven Sutra painting. Because after it was opened, the characters on it would flow. The words on the black and white paper flowed endlessly. If one wanted to see it clearly, they had to circulate their spiritual power and clear their mind. If the cultivation of the person looking at it wasn't high enough, it was easy to lose their mind. If there was no one to protect them, they would probably have to use up some of their essence chi in cultivation. Red Lady raised her head and looked at Su Sheng. Su Sheng looked at the map and said, "Ah, so it's this one. This one. It's the 36 words divine ability. Although, it doesn't seem to be a profound technique now. However, it's the first technique that the Celestials taught to mortals in the secular world." Ah. He blinked regretfully. "I always wanted to take a look at it. I didn't expect to see it here. But now that I see it, I don't think it's anything special." He spoke slowly. Not only could Li Yunxin not stand it, but Red Lady also couldn't stand it. Without waiting for him to finish, she put this one aside and opened the third one. The result was the same as the previous one. However, the previous one was the first technique that the Celestials taught to Dao Tong, and this one was the first technique that the Celestials taught to Kenzo. Red Lady also put the third one aside. Therefore, at this moment, both of their gazes became solemn. "I said it before. Maybe it doesn't exist." Li Yunxin sighed and reached out to take the token between the two. Red Lady didn't stop him. The token looked ordinary and unremarkable. It seemed like it had been there for many years. It was light yellow, neither gold nor jade, and seemed to be carved out of an unknown material. The surface was smooth and there were almost no decorations. Only the front side was carved with a shallow Ling character. Looking at it, it seemed like someone used this thing to practice carving. However, this character was only carved lightly, and was delayed by something, so he threw it aside. It was only today that it saw the light of day again. But as soon as he held it in his hand, his expression froze. After about a breath's time, he turned his hand and passed it to Red Lady, frowning and whispering, "Try it?" Then he turned his face and asked Su Sheng in a serious tone, "What's the origin of this thing?" Because of his demeanor and tone, Red Lady immediately straightened her back and took the token. Then, like Li Yunxin, she was stunned. She opened her mouth but didn't know what to say. Su Sheng stared at the token and narrowed his eyes as if he was recalling something. When Li Yunxin saw Red Lady's expression, he said in a deep voice, "Did you feel it?" Red Lady hesitated for a while. "It's a little familiar. It's the dragon aura." Li Yunxin said seriously and looked at her solemnly, "You just merged with the dragon soul not long ago, so you are not familiar with this feeling. But for me it's the dragon aura. The aura of dragons." Red Lady didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slightly closed her eyes and sensed for a while, then said, "But the aura is a little strange. You also felt it?" Li Yunxin immediately answered, "The aura is mixed. The dragon aura is only one of them. There are other auras but I can't distinguish them at the moment. Have you thought it through?" It seemed that this token really aroused his interest. At this moment, Li Yunxin looked a little anxious and even shouted at Su Sheng. However, Su Sheng was not very sensitive to these things now. After Li Yunxin shouted again after 5 or 6 breaths, the reincarnation of the master of calligrapher said, "This? I also don't know its origin." After a pause he said, "But I know that it was originally a scale." The characters were also carved by Chen Hua. She said that she picked up a piece of scale and made it into this thing. But Chen Hua was not patient. He got tired of fiddling with it for a few days and threw it aside. "So, I also don't know its origin." Hearing this, Li Yunxin let out a sigh of relief. Then he turned to Red Lady and said in a low voice, "Do you know who first spread the news that there is a treasure on Cloud Mountain that can control a group of demons and transform into a dragon by getting it?" Red Lady didn't speak. She held the token and only looked at Li Yunxin. She didn't know what he was thinking. Li Yunxin frowned and said to himself, "It was spread by the art saint Chen Hua. Now it seems, the news was spread by the art saint. This thing was carved by the art saint, and it has dragon aura." He was silent for a while as if he was thinking carefully. Finally he let out a long breath and looked at Red Lady, "Although we still don't know how to use this treasure. But maybe we have found it." Chapter 5:14. Red Lady still didn't speak. Seeing her like this, Li Yunxin shook his head. "Okay. Think about it slowly, but there are still people waiting for me outside." Bai Yunxin said that things would change in a few hours. I don't think he was exaggerating. So, I don't have much time. He stood up while speaking, picked up the 3 scrolls in Red Lady's hand and put them into his ring. "I'm going to the Qi Palace now. Are you coming with me?" After saying this, he stretched out his hand to take the 5th item, the wooden box. Red Lady was still in deep thought. But when Li Yunxin's hand was about to touch the wooden box, she suddenly stretched out her hand and pressed it down. Then she looked up at Li Yunxin with an expressionless face. "I haven't seen it yet. Why are you in such a hurry?" Li Yunxin's expression slightly stagnated. Red Madam smiled. "Could it be that what Li Lang wants the most is this?" After saying this, Their gazes met for a full 3 breaths of time. Li Yunxin slowly withdrew his hand. He sighed softly, treasuring jade is a sin. I thought you understood this a long time ago. Whether the dragon soul in your body is a trap or not, these days you have been captured, haven't you realized it? Red Lady raised her eyebrows. Oh, if that's the case, this is the treasure I'm looking for. You already knew it. But Li Yunxin just frowned and looked at her. Now you have the dragon soul. If you take this thing, do you really think you can climb the clouds and transform into dragons with this thing? This kind of words can only be used to deceive those stupid monsters, and now you are already dragons. Don't you know that there is no such thing as climbing the clouds and transforming into dragons in this world? Do you also believe in the carp leaping over the dragon gate like those mortals? Red Lady was silent for a while and smiled. But this smile seemed a little sad. I have told you before. I don't want any of the treasures on the Cloud Mountain. I only want this one, and you promised me. But now, you're not even willing to give me this? Li Yunxin sighed again. Do you still not understand what I mean? You can't take this treasure now, because it couldn't really make you invincible in the world and control all the demons. Zither Master, Hatred, Evil Lord, and even other demon kings, none of them would bow down to you. If you take it away now, other than making people chase after you and creating trouble for yourself, there's no benefit at all. Red Madam looked at him. But why did you lie to me? Why did you lie to me just now? Seeing her like this, Li Yunxin was silent for a while. Then he spread his hands helplessly. I'm doing this for your own good. Red Madam let out a sad smile. Ah, it's for my own good. Then she retracted her smile and looked straight at Li Yunxin. I am no longer the Red Lady of the past. She was already dead. Why did you lie to me again? Li Yunxin sighed. Let's take a step back. Even if you know how to use this treasure, you can still surrender to all the demons. Is that the kind of life you want? Do you know what you really want? Why did you lie to me again? Maybe you're so obsessed with what you want to do now because you miss your June? Why did you lie to me again? I just used a trick. Why did you lie to me again? Li Yunxin was silent for a while. Then he sighed helplessly and spread his hands. I'm sorry. But Red Madam only repeated the same sentence. There was a hint of sadness in her voice, but she was calm and not hysterical. Why did you lie to me again? Li Yunxin was silent for a while. This time he was silent for a longer time than before. Then he looked at Red Madam and opened his mouth. It seemed like he wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in his throat. After a few breaths he finally said, Because I'm afraid. Red Madam was stunned. At this time, Li Yunxin stood in front of her and slightly lowered his head to look at her. She didn't know if it was because the Kuan Palace was too dark, but Red Madam felt that Li Yunxin's eyes were slightly flickering, as if he was hiding or avoiding something. She also saw him slightly close his eyes. Although it was only for a very short moment, she felt that she could be sure that it was him who closed his eyes. He seemed to have thought of something bad, but he also seemed to be trying hard to calm himself down. Then Li Yunxin shook his head and smiled. Because I'm afraid. He looked at Red Madam. Aren't you afraid? This is the way of the world. Red Madam blinked and opened her mouth, but she didn't say anything. It seemed that she didn't expect that Li Yunxin would say such a thing. Who would have thought? Li Yunxin, who was known for his cunning and madness, Li Yunxin, who often risked his life to do many crazy things that people didn't dare to think about, he actually said that he was afraid. He laughed again. Before you became a wandering soul, you were a wandering soul. In this terrible world, if there were some ferocious demons and cultivators around you, would you be afraid? Red Madam hesitated for a moment. I would. Li Yunxin looked at her. So I didn't dare to say anything and I didn't dare to do anything. At that time, when you were in Dongting, you were the princess of Dongting. For me, he sighed softly. You were also a ferocious and terrible demon. I was afraid. Red Madam suddenly widened her eyes and almost stood up, but she bit her lip in the end. Didn't I treat you well enough? Even now. Li Yunxin was silent for a while and whispered, You have always treated me well. Even now. But the good you treat me may not be what I want. So, I will be afraid. You. Red Madam gritted her teeth. Li Yunxin. Li Yunxin looked at her silently. The two of them stared at each other for a while before Red Lady moved her gaze away and said in a low voice, I have never thought of harming you. Now you don't need to be afraid. Can protect you. Li Yunxin laughed loudly. After laughing for more than 10 seconds, he suddenly stopped laughing and looked at her. Who do you think I am? Red Madam's face became cold. Okay. I will take you as a man of indomitable spirit. Then this thing, as she said, she raised her hand and grabbed the wooden box on the table. Are you going to take it away from me? Li Yunxin looked at her seriously and took a step back. With my current personal ability, I can't take it away from you. But he suddenly turned to look at Su Sheng and said quickly, go to the prison of Yunshan and find Lu Gongzan and Shanji. Then take them out of Yunshan and send them to a place I can find. Finally, forget it. For a moment, Red Madam didn't know what he meant by the last 3 words. But as soon as he heard Li Yunxin shout, go, Su Sheng was suddenly like a puppet that had its strings pulled. He quivered from head to toe. His eyes regained their vigor immediately. His eyes stayed on Li Yunxin and Red Madam for a while. Without saying any nonsense, he turned around and flew away. Red Madam now understood what he meant. If Su Sheng left, she couldn't figure out the real mystery of this wooden box for a while. But why did he do this? Li Yunxin. Red Madam stood up and shouted in a low voice, what are you going to do? If there is something that can deter the demons, it means that there is something that can control the overall situation of the world. Li Yunxin took 3 steps back and stood in front of the door. I have worked hard to plan the layout, and now the world is in turmoil and a great calamity is about to break out. If you really comprehend and use this thing, the worst outcome that I've anticipated will happen. You'll really be able to control the demons. I won't be able to live for long. He gritted his teeth and said, I once promised a person that neither you nor I can afford to offend. What I am doing now is what I promised him. Once this thing fails, not only will I not live long, but I will probably never be able to transcend after I die. So, at least for now, on this Shaoyin Mountain, I won't let you get what you want. Little you, I am doing this for myself and for you. Finally, I advise you, don't hurt me and yourself. Red Madam stared at him. Who are you working for? Why are you so scared? But Li Yunxin didn't say anything. He pursed his lips and only looked at her. Red Madam stared at him for a while, then she suddenly raised her hand and fiercely struck. However, this palm was not aimed at Li Yunxin. With a humming sound, the majestic demonic power blasted a hole through the Kuan Hall. Its momentum did not diminish and it headed towards the east. The strong wind stirred up in the hall turned the broken bricks and tiles into a storm, hitting the 2 of them, but they were all broken into the tiniest pieces and dust. In the dust, Red Madam said in a low voice, good. In that case, I have broken the restriction of the Qi Hall in the east. Li Yunxin, if you want the elixir, go ahead. But I am going to leave Shaoyin Mountain and chase after the reincarnation of the Master of Calligrapher. Although my father taught me the method to leave Shaoyin Mountain, I am not good at it and will definitely cause a big commotion. At that time, the people of Xianmen will know that Shaoyin Mountain has been breached and will definitely come back to help. Whether you can escape or not, depends on your own luck. After she said these words, she was silent for a long time. So the dust and gravel that had been stirred up before slowly fell down. But he still couldn't see her face clearly, because there was a thick mist rising up, wrapping around her face. Li Yunxin. He finally heard her say, from today onwards we are no longer friends. Then, the mist rose up to the sky. Then, the mist rose up to the sky. It turned into a gust of wind and disappeared into the horizon. Li Yunxin stood alone in front of the lonely Kuan Hall and pinched his little finger. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and smiled. Then he lowered his head. Alas. Chapter 5:15. There was nothing left in the Kuan Hall. Red Madam took the box away, leaving the place in a mess. Li Yunxin stood there for the time it took for half an incense stick to burn before he slowly raised his hand and brushed off the dirt and dust that had fallen on his shoulders and head. Then he let out a light breath, turned around, and planned to go out and walk in the direction of the Qi Hall. The roof of the Kuan Hall had been broken by Red Madam. Sunlight poured down so it was not so dark. But when Li Yunxin took a step forward, he suddenly stopped and turned his head to look behind him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a bit of golden light in the pile of broken bricks and tiles on the ground. He was stunned for a moment, thinking that it was his illusion. But when he turned around and saw it clearly, he was completely stunned. That golden flash was very easy to recognize. It was the token that had some dragon aura but also other mixed auras. The token lay on the ground, only a corner of it was exposed among the dirt and stones. But this thing was very hard and its surface was polished smooth. It was still shining faintly among the ruins. He opened his mouth but said nothing. He exhaled once more and after a long while, he walked up to the token. He bent down and picked it up. He slowly wiped it clean, held it in his hand and looked at it for a while. The token and the box. Between the two of them, it was hard to say which one was more likely to be the treasure that would allow him to control all the demons once he obtained it. Maybe it was the token or maybe it was the box. He could have taken them both. Li Yunxin was silent for a long time, and finally put the token into his little finger. He turned around and went out, silently going straight to the Qi Hall. Little Cloud Mountain was not a place that could be casually entered and exited. Su Yusong and Zhuomuzha had been trapped here for 1,000 years. Other than the elders not allowing them to leave Little Cloud Mountain, this place was difficult to enter and difficult to leave. But for the 3 people who had been here before, this place did not seem difficult to get out. The reincarnation of the master of calligrapher naturally had a way. By Yunxin, she retreated so decisively, so she must have a way. Her feather robe was said to be a treasure that could enter and exit the sealed space of Golden Rock King, so it should not be difficult to get out of Little Cloud Mountain. Red Madam? Red Madam said that her monarch father had taught her the method of Mount Chuyun. As a big monster who has been guarding Dongting for 2,000 years, the Lord Dongting actually knows this. But with so many secrets on him, it wasn't strange to have one more. As for Li Yunxin, he used to have a way to get out. His method was to revive. However, Su Sheng had managed to escape earlier. Now he was truly trapped here. However, he was already familiar with being trapped, so he did not panic. Red Madam said that if she went out of Mount Shaoyin, she might alert the people of the Profound Sect to come back to help. When the people from the Celestial Sect of Wonders returned to help, he would have a chance to get out. He had always taken risks when doing things and accidents often happened. This time, to be able to safely collect all the treasures in the Chenghuan Palace and the Chenghuan Palace and the Qi Palace was already an unimaginably fruitful result. Nothing unexpected happened in the Palace of Qi. The restriction in the palace was directly broken by Red Lady. The elixirs and items in the palace were also scattered because of the airwaves and impact, but they were generally unharmed. Li Yunxin collected these things one by one, and also some things used for making elixirs. After doing all this, he still didn't hear any movement. Maybe Red Lady needed to make some preparations before she went out of the mountain. The Qi Palace was situated on a small hill. It was originally a lonely palace surrounded by a green river. After plundering, Li Yunxin jumped to the top of the palace and sat down. At this time the sky began to dim. A short and long day in Mount Shaoyin was about to end. The sunlight was no longer clear, gradually turning red and faint. He sat on the top of the palace. He slowly turned the token between the fingers of his left hand. In his right hand, he grabbed a handful of golden little beans. These beans were 9 cycles Taizixia pills. According to the Book of Elixir, it was used to bring the dead back to life and be reborn. It was used to cure all kinds of injuries, 5 labors and 7 injuries, and all kinds of illnesses that cannot be cured by 100 medicines. The spiritual power contained in it was astonishing. If one of them was released into Jianghu in the secular world, it would set off a reign of terror. But at this moment, Li Yunxin only ate them as snacks. One by one he threw them into his mouth, chewing noisily. But it actually wasn't delicious. The main ingredients of this pill were cinnabar and gold leaf. After chewing, it was dry and crumbly as if he was eating soil. But he didn't feel anything about it. He slowly twirled the token in his hand. No one knew what he was thinking. Time passed like this. Only the low chirping of birds could be heard. Then the entire world shook. It was as if his head had been hit hard. The scenery in front of him trembled slightly. It was as if a huge hammer had hit the restriction of this Mount Shaoyin. So he knew that Red Lady had come out of the mountain. 18 hours had passed since he had died and escaped in front of the formation. These 18 hours could be considered as a rare, peaceful period. But now the peaceful days should be over. He probably had to deal with the coming storm again. But this time he felt that he might not be as passive and strenuous as before. He had planned everything carefully, and what he wanted was to take the initiative. Now he wanted to see if his initiative could get any interesting results. For example, kill a nuisance maybe too. This should have been something he had been looking forward to for a long time. Thinking about it now, he should be happy and the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. But Li Yunxin's face was expressionless. He could only play with the token in his hand for a while in this precious and limited amount of time. Then he put it away. He turned his left hand again and took out a scroll. It was the Imperial Map that recorded the terrain of the 36 countries of the Midland. He jumped off the roof and looked for a flat place. He spread out the 8 feet long and 8 feet wide map. Then he stared at it and looked at it carefully. This was both a topographical map and an administrative map. Other than this, it could even be considered a simplified historical record. In some places, it marked what major events had happened in the history of this place and used simple language to describe the general outline of the matter. For example, when he first saw the map, he naturally went to find his current location. Thus he found the Qing Kingdom. The shape of the Qing Kingdom was like a large pancake on the map, but the north side had been taken a few bites. The bites were the Yi Kingdom between the Li Kingdom and the rooster-like Yi Kingdom. He also saw that in the territory of the Qing Kingdom, there was a matter recorded in words smaller than a sesame seed. It roughly said that 500 years ago in the present Qing Kingdom, what had once been the Yi Kingdom, there had been a great earthquake. This earthquake affected a wide area. It included the present Yi Kingdom and half of the Qing Kingdom. Millions of people lost their homes, mountains collapsed, and rivers changed course. It was tragic. Perhaps because of this, the Yi Kingdom's national strength was greatly damaged and the people had no way to make a living. Later, the Yi Emperor offended the goddess, which was why a disaster fell and the country was severed. These should be the stories of the people. However, in the eyes of people like Li Yunxin, there had to be something strange about this rare change of dynasty in tens of thousands of years. The other problem was, this map had been hidden in the Kuan Palace for a long time. However, it marked the great earthquake 500 years ago. This meant that someone had purposely recorded this matter. 500 years was an unimaginably long time for the people of the secular world. However, for this map it was like it had happened yesterday. Who had recorded it? But this was not a problem that he had to figure out right now. At least, Li Yunxi knew that there was something strange about this map. In reality, this was not the only place that was strange. There were many other places. The mountains and rivers in this map were slowly outlined with a brush. Although the entire map looked precise and orderly, the painter still had the style of this era. When drawing a map, they also sought to create scenery everywhere. The mountains and rivers in the map, looking at them alone, were an intricate painting. Rather than saying this entire map was a map, it was better to say it was a mountain and river map that could be admired. This mountain and river map was also colored. For a map, coloring like an ordinary painting was like drawing legs on a snake. This made the words in the map difficult to distinguish and look dazzling. But it was precisely this color that made Li Yunxin pay more attention. There were many places where the color was also strange. This kind of strangeness could probably only be seen by people who were proficient in the art of painting. For example, ordinary mountains used a light cyan color and mountain rocks used ochre. At the bottom of the mountain, where vegetation was lush, stone was often used. But occasionally in some places the color was not right. At the top of the mountain, stone was used, while at the bottom of the mountain, flour was used. Mountain rocks did not use ochre but dawn red, and so on and so forth. Actually, it was not a big problem to look at it this way. In the eyes of ordinary people, the scenery seemed disorderly and the color was jumpy. Although it was not systematic, it was still pleasing to the eye. There were about 36 such abnormal scenery, and they were located in the 36 countries in the map. As mentioned before, the places that Li Yunxin had walked through so far were less than the size of half a palm in this map. One could imagine how small a mountain range or a river in the painting would be. If it was a secular person with poor eyesight, he would not be able to see it clearly. And these 36 abnormal scenery were distributed in the 36 countries, so it should not be noticed by people. But he had subconsciously looked for his position in the map before, and he was very sensitive to the art of painting and the use of color. Therefore he could see it at first glance. At that time he was hesitant, but he looked at other places in the map. Finally, he realized that there was such a place in every country. 36. This was a very sensitive number. Because there were 36 of the most important major acupoints in the human body. When Red Madam was still around, Li Yunxin's eyes only glanced at the painting for a fleeting moment. Only now did he look carefully. He found the Manwan Mountain where the Guanyuan crypt where hatred was previously stationed. The color of the Manwan Mountain was indeed not right. Chapter 5:16. When he was in Hatred's palace, Baisanren once said that he could gather the souls of the dead in the Guanyuan cave in the mountain and refine them into demonic power. He also said that the Guanyuan cave was very similar to the Guanyuan point in the human body. It could both consolidate qi and gather demonic power. He also mentioned that before he died he was a cultivator of Daotong and Shenmen. His practice focused on the spiritual qi of the mountains and rivers, so he was very sensitive to such things. Then 2,000 years ago he accidentally discovered the existence of feng shui. In many natural mountains and rivers in the world, there were actually wind points like the meridians and meridians of the same kind. Therefore he came up with a theory, but it was not accepted by Xianmen. Thus he was angry and died of depression. After he died, he was saved by Qin Jun and became a ghost cultivator. But later, in Hatred's palace, Bai Yunxin told Li Yunxin about the past of the Golden Rock King being sealed. From this, Li Yunxin knew that the natural cave that Bai Sanren found was not natural. It was part of the formation that was used to seal the Golden Rock King 2,000 years ago. And now, Li Yunxin knew that the eye of the formation was in Dongting. But in the kingdom of Qing, there was another place that was different, the Evil King's Pitfall Mountain. Li Yunxin found the Pitfall Mountain in the map. As expected, the color of the Pitfall Mountain was also different. This meant that the Pitfall Mountain was actually a big cave that resembled a human. However, he knew that the Guanyuan Point in the mountain was the Guanyuan Point, but he didn't know what it was in the Pitfall Mountain. In the real world there were many mountains, rivers, villages and towns. The direction and height of the mountains, the types of vegetation, and the density of the vegetation. Even the amount of water in the mountains and the composition of the soil and stones all had a great impact on the qi and the composition of the spiritual qi. Even if he had straightened out and figured out the aura of the mountain, a mountain and a river did not exist independently. Were there any landforms near the mountains or rivers? Were there any signs of human habitation? What would affect the qi activity and spiritual energy of the mountains or rivers? Even if he had straightened out the qi activity and spiritual energy near the mountains and rivers, it had to be known that there was another place near these mountains and rivers. Even with Li Yunxin's intelligence, it was impossible for him to figure out which acupoint it was and what it was used for with just a glance. Therefore, he only knows that there are a total of 37 acupoints on the map, including the Dongding Circle Eye. It seems that they constitute the big circle to seal the Golden Rock King as mentioned by Bai Yunxin. However, there was another thing that Bai Yunxin did not know. There were skeletons in the crypt of the Pitfall Mountain. There was also a skeleton in the crypt of Manwan Mountain. Did this mean that there were skeletons in the remaining 34 crypts as well? Bai Yunxin said that this big circle was built by the three sages in Shinryu 2,000 years ago. But, if it was built at that time, how could the master of calligraphy not know about skeletons and ancient demons? It showed that Bai Yunxin's statement, if she did not deliberately deceive him, was not complete. There were other secrets hidden in the past history. But for Li Yunxin at the moment, these were not important. Most importantly, he thought, this Huangyu sky painting was the legendary treasure that could shock the demons. After all, this news was spread by Qin Zhao, the master of calligraphy. She spread the news, so the treasure must have been left by her. Since it was something left behind by her, based on Li Yunxin's understanding of her, she knew that it would be unexpected. That token really did look like that treasure. However, the treasure was too obvious. Li Yunxin did not touch the wooden box. But just by looking at it, he knew that the mystery was too obvious. With the naked eye, there was almost nothing special about it. But this Huangyu sky painting, once it was opened, all the secrets on it were revealed openly. It was up to you to see if you knew what it was. This was Qin Zhao's style, straightforward and obscure. As for how it could shock the demons, perhaps it was because it was marked with the 36 major acupoints used to suppress the Golden Rock King and a formation eye? Or because it could release the Golden Rock King after obtaining it? If a super big demon in the Grand Supreme Realm came back, it could naturally shock the world. But the problem was, it was the Golden Rock King who shocked the demons, not the holder of the painting. Or, the skeletons? The skeletons called ancient demons could bring terrible disasters to the world once they appeared. Was it to shock the demons? But the problem was, would this, if you don't give me face we will all die together method work on the demons? This was an obvious thought. Anyone who had obtained the map and knew something about it would be able to think of it. Thus, Li Yunxin felt that these weren't the real secrets of the painting. But he also felt that there was no reason why he couldn't figure out the so-called real secret. Even if he couldn't completely unravel the mystery, there was no reason why he didn't have any clues. Because he already knew so many things. His understanding of the magnificent history and secrets of the past was already far greater than anyone else in the world. Moreover, he was the person with the highest cultivation in painting in the world, and he was extremely smart. If he couldn't figure it out no matter how much he thought about it, probably no one else in the world could. Perhaps the answer was already in his mind. It just depended on whether he could find it or not. Then, he needed to find out what made him different from others. This different couldn't be especially smart, especially handsome, especially meaningful, and especially elegant, which were innate and couldn't be imitated by others. Instead, It should be something that appeared after birth, which made him different from others. The painting scroll. The painting path. The art saint. The secret was unique. After 3 breaths, Li Yunxin suddenly froze. He realized that just 10 days ago he had done something stupid that he thought he was smart. The Clarity Jade Slip. Perhaps the secret of the Imperial Heavenly Scripture diagram was hidden in the Jade Slip of Clarity. But when he thought of the Clarity Jade Slip, everything became clear. Why did the 2 wandering souls want the Clarity Jade Slip? Who added the recent records in the painting scroll? Perhaps the 2 wandering souls realized that the secret of the Imperial Heavenly Painting was related to the Clarity Jade Slip, so they wanted it. Previously, the Clarity Jade Slip was in his hands, and the painting was in the hands of the wandering souls. But today the painting was in his hands and the Clarity Jade Slip was in the hands of the 2 wandering souls. Really, damn it? He gritted his teeth and stood in place for a while, then spun a few rounds in anger. He looked around, lifted his foot and kicked over a copper cauldron beside him. He scolded, "Stupid, stupid, stupid." His face was ferocious and even the sides of his cheeks were covered with fine scales. The fangs in his mouth were sharp and every time he scolded, the fine scales on his cheeks would expand. If it weren't for the restriction that prevented him from completely transforming into the godly demon body, every time he scolded, the sky would probably explode with rolling thunder. When had he, Li Yunxin, done such a stupid thing? He had given away the most important thing that he had already obtained. Compared to losing the thing that he had never obtained, being robbed or being cheated, this was more unbearable for him, and it made him irritable and furious. But after all, Li Yunxin was not a person who liked to feel sorry for himself. After venting his anger, he finally suppressed his emotions for the time being. He immediately began to recall the things that he had noticed or not noticed when he examined the contents of the Jade Slip several times in the past. As he thought about it, he flew back into the Qi Palace. Red Madam smashed the main door of the Palace of Qi with a palm strike. But the Palace of Qi was quite big and there were several rooms inside. Moreover, the chests and cabinets that used to store elixirs and treasures had been turned upside down by him, and pillows were strewn all over the floor, filling up the entire palace. Previously, his demonic power was almost exhausted. But he had recklessly eaten a lot of elixirs, and at this moment his demonic power had almost recovered. Therefore he used the limited magical power that he could use in this little cloud mountain's restriction, and based on the terrain, Qi movement and position, he set up a formation. When he finished setting up the formation, he removed a copper plate from the fallen cabinet with his bare hands. After thinking for a moment, he stretched out his finger and carved 7 words on the copper plate. "Those who see these words will die here." When he carved these 7 words, there was no joking expression on his face. His expression was solemn, frighteningly serious. After he finished carving, he reached out his hand and brushed the copper plate, making the writing on the surface hazy and unclear. Then he fiercely inserted the copper plate into the ground, and with a thud, it stood still. Previously he gave away the clear jade slip because he felt that it was useless to him in a short period of time. Previously he planned to take all the treasures in the Cloud Mountain and leave, also because he felt that the so-called thing that could intimidate the group of demons after obtaining it did not exist, and was only an excuse. But just like before, there were always variables in the plan. And this time the variable was quite significant. The red carp in the transcendent state suddenly merged with the dragon soul, and turned into a super great demon whose realm was unknown, but obviously was ridiculously strong. And because of this super great demon's obsession, in the end this thing was sent to Li Yunxin. It was fine if he did not obtain this thing. Since he had already obtained it and he knew that the clue to unravel the important secret of this map might be the clear jade slip, and the clear jade slip had been sent to the 2 wandering souls, with his overwhelming courage and conceited personality, if he did not get the clear jade slip back, how could his thoughts be clear? If he just left like this, the thought of, "I gave the treasure to the enemy for nothing, and now I don't know how long I will have to wait to get it back," would always be suppressed in his heart. Not to mention the realm, cultivation and inner demons. Even he himself would be driven mad by himself. He hated and couldn't tolerate idiots the most. The 2 wandering souls always called themselves sages. But until now, Li Yunxin had never seen the true power of a sage. The art sage was long gone. The calligraphy sage and the sword sage were also gone. The true power of a sage that he had seen was probably Shinryu. However, that night when he met Shinryu in a hurry, he did not learn much. Looking at it this way, the 2 wandering souls might be considered as the top martial force in the world today. And Li Yunxin, now he wanted to give it a try. Could he kill this so-called top martial force in the world? Take back the thing that he felt would drive him crazy if he did not take it back. Chapter 517. However, whether it was Li Yunxin, the demons, or even the reincarnation of the sage of calligrapher, they all overlooked another issue. Why did the Yunshan land in the Tongtian swamp? It was said that the Yunshan would land every 500 years to replenish the qi of earth and wood in the array. But in reality, not many people had actually seen the Yunshan land. The span of 500 years had exceeded the lifespan of most cultivators. In this world, if a mortal died after living for more than 60 years, it would be considered a happy funeral. When cultivators reached the state of enlightenment, their lifespan would be less than 100 years, but their bodies were stronger and healthier than ordinary people. When they reached the state of emptiness, they would live a healthy and happy life until they were 50 or 60 years old. However, in the Jianghu of the mortal world, they would be regarded as the most powerful and immortal demon/monster/giant hero. Only when they reached the state of transcendent would they have the appearance of Sendo. If they liked it, there was a way to stay young forever. If they could still look youthful when they reached the state of transcendent, they could live for 200 or 300 years. The state of transcendent was the highest state that most people could reach in their lifetime. Any higher than that would not be achieved by hard work and diligence. The factor of talent began to show, and it became one of the most important factors. When some people broke through from the state of transcendent to the state of true, it was as if the path that they were born to walk was right in front of them. Others went through a lot of hardships and only got a dead end. Therefore, there were very few cultivators in the state of true and above. Some of these people had experienced the fall of the Yunshan last time. But in reality, for the real cultivators, it did not matter if the Yunshan was in the sky or on the ground. It had only been a dozen days. For them, it was just a snap of the fingers. In the minds of many people, the two saints were the ones who were involved. It was said that the reason why the Yunshan could walk in the sky was because the little Yunshan where the saints lived hid an array that powered the entire Yunshan. And this array was not the spell that Dao Tong and Kenzo cultivated, it was the work of the celestial beings. The celestial beings created the Yunshan for the cultivators to live in and protect this world. The history of the Yunshan was earlier than the history of the Shenmen. Cultivators thought that the saints knew the secrets of the celestial beings' array. However, the truth was that even the saints did not know much about it. Over the course of 50,000 years, the sages had never been able to see the core of the formation. And every 500 years at this time, it would be the same as now. First, they placed the red soil and other materials that had been transported from the designated area at the foot of the mountain. When the cloud mountain landed, the formation outside sucked all those things into the mountain and sent them to Little Cloud Mountain through some unknown passage. For many years, no one had truly understood how this process worked. Cultivators thought that the saints knew, but the only thing the saints knew was that this was the will of the Deva. The celestials did not want the mortals to have a glimpse of the deeper mysteries. If someone defied the will of the heavens, it would only invite disaster. There was already such a lesson in the history of the celestial sect of wonders. The saints of the celestial sect of wonders did not dare and would not have any other thoughts. However, the fake saints played by the two wandering souls were not without desires. Indeed, they had once thought of investigating it to the end. Although the elders also claimed to be the reincarnations of the Deva, the elders had never been interested in worldly matters and seemed to put all their energy into other areas. Therefore, in the past 1,000 years, Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia had the time and conditions to explore this mystery. However, what was disappointing and inconceivable was that even though they knew that the array that drove the entire Cloud Mountain was in the floating mountain of Little Cloud Mountain, they could not find it. Therefore, until now, no one paid attention to the landing of the Cloud Mountain. The demons wanted to take this opportunity to attack the Cloud Mountain. The cultivators wanted to protect the Cloud Mountain, but they realized that the celestial sect of wonders had undergone a terrible change. Therefore, some high-level cultivators left and low-level cultivators died. Those who did not die did not have the right to know what had happened. In the end, everyone was fighting over the word power. The secret of Cloud Mountain itself, because of many common reasons, no one cared about it. However, something that many people intentionally or unintentionally ignored did not mean it did not exist. At this moment, Li Yunxin was setting up the array that would be used to deal with the two wandering souls in the messy Qi Hall in order to recapture the Jade Slip of Enlightenment. Therefore, he did not know that there were other people on the floating mountain at the same time. He had always wanted to see the true faces of the Freemasonry elders, whom he viewed as formidable opponents. It was said that there were more than 400 elders, all of whom were Grand Supreme. With so many Grand Supreme experts, It would be easy for them to dominate the world if they came out in full force. Why did they need to hide and set up the Freemasonry in the dark? Why did they call the two wandering souls saints and secretly control the celestial sect of wonders? Therefore, he thought that there were three possibilities that caused the current situation. First, they were indeed grand supreme experts. But perhaps they had some discord with the Deva in the sky, so they did not dare to show themselves. But now that the Deva had not shown themselves for 1,000 years, and the Freemasonry was ready to cause trouble for the celestial sect of wonders, what did these people have to fear? Then, second, perhaps these people were not interested in the affairs of the secular world. However, according to Li Yunxin's current observations, this assumption was no longer valid. Therefore, there was only one possibility left. This possibility seemed a little unbelievable. Before Li Yunxin met Su Weng, Su Sheng, and the fake saint, he would not have thought about this. But now, he had no choice but to think so. The so-called 446 Grand Supreme Elders were in a similar situation to the Sage of Calligraphy, the Sage of Sword, and the Wandering Souls. They might have the cultivation of Grand Supreme, but for some reason they could not use it. Therefore, they hid in the dark and asked the two Wandering Souls to do it for them. This world was not an era where one or two experts could dominate the world. How strong was the Golden Rock King back then? Wasn't he still in the seal now? How powerful was the Shinryu? Now, for some unknown reason he had restrained his sharpness, wasn't he? No matter how strong they were, if they went against the trend they might be able to take the limelight for a while, but they would eventually be defeated by the power of the world. But even so, subconsciously, Li Yunxin was extremely afraid of those mysterious people. Afraid but also very much wanted to meet them. Because he felt that those so-called elders might have something in common with him. Because of this, when he was in the Red Ridge, he even wanted to lure the elders of the Freemasonry here. But in the end, nothing came of it. However, now that he was on the floating mountain, he did not know that the elders he wanted to meet were originally on Cloud Mountain, at the peak of Cloud Mountain. He also did not know that the elders he was deeply afraid of were not only on Cloud Mountain, but also on the floating mountain. In fact, the four elders had arrived on the floating mountain 30 minutes ago. At that time, Li Yunxin was eating elixirs like beans on the roof of the Temple of Qi. The floating mountain was vast and there were many layers of pavilions. Even though he had fought with Su Sheng and destroyed a lot of things, he could not turn the floating mountain into ruins. The group of palaces was like a small city, and it was difficult for people in the west to know what happened on the east side of the city. So he did not know that when the four elders saw the floating mountain they were also shocked. Among the four of them, one was the golden-haired Grandmaster D. And the four of them stepped out from a door that opened in the void. The door was formed by 4 rays of light, and appeared at the back of the dome hall. It was originally next to the waterside pavilion next to the dome hall. On the left and right side, there was a tree as thick as a few people's arms around it. The tree's shade was low and there were flowers and grass covering it, so the location was very hidden. But now the appearance of this place had changed greatly. Previously, when Li Yunxin destroyed the waterside pavilion, rubble and tiles flew everywhere. Moreover, he had used the strength of a true realm great demon to destroy the waterside pavilion, which was made of materials harder than metal and stone. The power of the flying rubble was not ordinary. So the trees and flowers in the vicinity were all destroyed. 2 huge trees were cut off from their roots, lying on the ground in a crisscross position, as if they had been ravaged by a terrible hurricane. When Grandmaster D stepped out of this door, the expression on his face immediately changed. Actually, it was not calm to begin with. His face was tight and the corners of his mouth were also tight. His eyes flickered and his limbs were slightly stiff. If Li Yunxin saw this, he would immediately know that this meant that the 4 of them were rather nervous and perturbed. It was as if they had lived in a busy city for a long time and stepped into a forest full of fierce beasts for the first time, afraid that a monster would suddenly pounce out from a corner. His expression turned cold, and the 3 people behind him who were about to step out had even more exaggerated reactions. First, they widened their eyes and looked around. Then they suddenly took 2 steps back and shouted in a low voice in panic, "Come back, come back." Something happened. This expression was far from the Grand Supreme Realm, in Li Yunxin's impression. But that Grandmaster D did not panic too much. Instead, he stood in front of the door and hid behind 2 fallen huge trees. He raised his hand and pressed it down, signaling them to be quiet. Then he frowned, listening and looking around with extreme vigilance. But at this time, it had been a long time since Li Yunxin became violent, and they could not hear or see anything. All they could see were ruins. They could also hear the chirping of birds and insects. It seemed that this was a quiet evening. After a full 10 breaths, Grandmaster D's expression finally relaxed a little. It's all right now. Come out. But the 3 people behind him still refused to step forward and only said, I think we should go back first. After we figure out the situation we will. Their current appearance was a world of difference from when they were talking to the 2 fake saints on the peak of Cloud Mountain. And Grandmaster D's current appearance was also a world of difference from when he raised his hand and slapped the wandering souls in the big house. In front of the 2 wandering souls, these elders were calm and serious. And Grandmaster D, who spoke the most, was extremely sharp, with a sense of oppression from a superior. Although Su Yusong and Zhuamuja were fake saints, in terms of cultivation and physical strength alone, they were far above the peak of the mysterious realm and could be considered superior. However, both of them were as humble as servants in front of Gong Di. But at this time, if these 4 people did not look like the elders in the big house, who would believe that they were like this now? Seeing the 3 people cowering, Grandmaster D turned his head and glared at them. Go back? You have to think about it. If this Cloud Mountain falls to the ground and can't fly again, what should we do? This sentence seemed to be very lethal to the 3 people. Among the 3, an old man in a green robe was originally speaking. Now that he heard Grandmaster D's question, he was stunned. It's not that serious. Grandmaster D glared at him again. If it's serious or not, it's up to you to decide. You will do the work later, okay? The old man did not speak. Grandmaster D snorted. Come out, all of you. What's there to be afraid of? Don't you know that there is a war outside? Since there is a war, isn't it normal for people to fight their way here? And it's here. What are you afraid of? The old man in the green robe said, We are not afraid of others. We are afraid of those 2. If they are lying in ambush? Grandmaster D sneered as if he was so angry that he laughed. Ambush? Don't you know how much Su Yusong and Zhuamuja want to go out? A few days ago I asked them to go out. What reason do they have to ambush us? You 3. Forget it. He sighed. You can go back. The old man and the 2 people behind him were overjoyed. Really? Really? Grandmaster D snorted in a low voice. I will go and have a look myself. If I can't do it well, I will also go back. We will wait for Cloud Mountain to fall to the ground, wait for those demons to come in, wait for us to die together. It's not a big deal. We can still go back, can't we? No one knew which of his words worked. After listening to him, the 3 people were immediately speechless. After a moment of silence, they looked at each other and finally stepped out of the light door. At this time, Li Yunxin realized that he had handed over the jade slip of enlightenment, which was very important. He was extremely upset. But he did not know that the 4 elders of the Freemasonry were actually in a much worse mood than he was. When he started to set up the formation in the Qi Palace, Grandmaster D and the 3 people behind him were also walking in the direction of the Qi Palace. Chapter 5:18. Along the way they saw many ruins. Most of these ruins were destroyed during the battle between Li Yunxin and Su Sheng. There were even embers burning in some places. Not to mention seeing such a scene in Little Cloud Mountain where almost no one could enter. Even if they saw such a scene in a city in the secular world, they would feel uneasy. But Grandmaster D was in front and the 3 people behind him, but he just kept a straight face and pressed the corners of his mouth tightly. He didn't seem to panic. It was as if he believed the unconvincing words he said to the 3 people before. Since there was a war outside, it was normal for someone to fight their way here. It showed that these 4 people seemed to have an extremely important thing to do. It was so important that even if they found out that there was an intruder here, they still had to brace themselves and go inside. The 4 people walked through the palace and ruins like this for almost 2 hours. They didn't hear any noise or see anyone and they slowly calmed down. Thus, they were no longer as restless and silent as before. They began to chat casually for a while. The old man first said, Who on earth fought their way in? This place looks strange. Did they fight for a while and then get kicked out again? These words were not very useful, but the 2 people behind him only agreed with yes, and strange. It seemed that the more they said such words, the more they believed that there were no enemies here and that they could affect reality. Grandmaster D originally ignored them. But after the 3 people behind him repeated these words for a long time, he seemed to be annoyed and said while walking, Why do you care who fought their way in? There is a problem with the core of Cloud Mountain, and there is also a problem with the restriction outside and the formation inside. We didn't notice it when we were in the sky and only noticed it now that we're on the ground. It means that if Su Yusong and Zhuamuja didn't do a good job outside, it's not impossible for a few demons to come in. But did you forget what you experienced in the past? How is the situation then compared to now? After all these years, what have you become? He asked a series of questions. When he said this, there was a huge stone blocking the road ahead. It was originally a stone pillar, and it needed more than 10 people to encircle it. After being blasted apart by Li Yunxin and Su Sheng, half of them were in the way. If one wanted to pass through here, they would either have to climb over a 2-story stone pillar or take a detour. However, Duke Di did not stop. As he walked, he raised his hand and patted the stone pillar in front of him with the back of his hand. It was as if what was blocking in front of him was just a bunch of leaves. There was a buzzing sound. The air in front of him immediately exploded into a large cloud of mist. Several bright electric arcs appeared in the fog, as if there were traces of lightning in a huge air bubble. The stone pillars blocking the way immediately turned into the tiniest specks of dust, dispersing into the air. It was not some kind of divine ability or Dao technique. It was just strength. The incredible strength and speed of a palm strike could tear apart even the tiniest unit in the air, let alone the stone pillar. The ruins the 4 of them had seen along the way, if they wanted to, it would only be a matter of raising their hands and feet. However, even though he had displayed such terrifying power, the 3 people behind him did not show the slightest bit of surprise or envy. It was as if they were already used to it. Moreover, they also had such power. Duke Di cleared the obstacle and continued to say, "Moreover, we should settle the things here and leave as soon as possible. What's there to be afraid of when we reach the sky?" But obviously, his words did not make the 3 people feel more at ease. No matter what they were going to do, it seemed that the 3 of them did not want to be involved. They just wanted Duke Di to settle it himself. At this moment, the ground suddenly shook. It was as if an earth dragon was turning over. The rubble in the ruins scattered, and the half-broken palaces collapsed with a rumble. The trees on the ground began to shake, and even the water in the pool began to shake violently, as if something was going to come out of the water. This situation had never happened on Mount Yinshan. However, instead of calling it an earthquake, it was more like someone outside the cloud mountain had slammed into the behemoth. The 4 of them were stunned by the sudden change. The shock only lasted for a moment. Soon, everything returned to normal. However, this change made the 3 elders, who were not brave enough to begin with, retreat again. They stopped and stared at Duke Di. What's wrong? Did they fight their way in? Duke Di opened his mouth and was about to speak, but he suddenly found that it was raining. There were no clouds above his head, but raindrops fell from the void. The appearance of these raindrops was also very strange. They were the size of soybeans and were dark blue, as if the deepest ocean had been frozen, and then the debris was taken out and polished into the shape of raindrops. They fell very slowly. As they fell, transparent, wave-like ripples appeared around them. It was as if the void on the floating mountain was water, and they were moving on the water. After about 2 breaths of time, the raindrops began to change color. However, the word discoloration couldn't accurately describe the changes that had occurred to them. They were originally dark blue, but now they began to turn into a deep black. However, even black could be considered a kind of color. But the black color of these raindrops was the black that appeared after all the colors were absorbed into it. In other words, it was nothingness. The next moment, the gravel, dust, withered leaves and sawdust that were scattered on the ground slowly floated up. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared. No one knew where it went. The raindrops fell without a sound, and the floating mountain remained silent. Before this, Grandpa Di looked calm, but the 3 elders behind him were restless. However, at this moment, when they saw the slowly falling black rain, there was only one word that could describe the expressions on the faces of Grandmaster Di and the 3 elders. Horrified. Extreme horror. Black spot? The old man shouted and ran back in the direction he came from. As he ran, the 2 people behind him also abandoned Gongzi Di and followed him after a slight hesitation. They had already been walking on the floating mountain for a quarter of an hour. In fact, they were already very far away from the door of light that they came out of. Although these things, which they called black spots, fell slowly, there were still a lot of them. The old man was so shocked that he almost lost his mind. He just wanted to run back into the light gate before they completely fell. At this moment, the fastest falling black spots were still more than 10 feet above their heads. Looking at their falling speed, it seemed that they could indeed reach their destination. However, he had just run 5 steps when the black spots above his head seemed to be attracted to him. After a slight pause, they suddenly gathered toward him like a swarm of flying insects. He originally had the strong body of a Grand Supreme, but now it seemed to be made of water. In just a breath's time, his body suddenly turned into liquid and was completely absorbed by the black spots. Seeing this horrifying scene, the two people behind him were at a loss. However, the black spots did not let them go. In the next moment, the two people's bodies were also covered by a group of black spots, and they instantly disappeared without a trace. 3. Elders, who had the bodies of Grand Supreme Realm experts, had been silently obliterated just like that. Grandmaster D's face was also filled with panic and fear that he could not hide. But at least he did not lose his mind. He stood in place for 3 breaths' time, as if he was also hesitating whether to turn back or continue doing the extremely important thing that he had repeatedly told the 3 people before. In the end, he took a deep breath and continued walking. But every step he took was extremely cautious, as if the slowly falling black spots in the sky were a group of terrifying beasts. And he was trying not to alarm them. His destination was the Qi Palace. There was still about a quarter of an hour's journey from here to the Qi Palace. He had to reach there before the black spots changed even more horribly and end everything. At this time, Li Yunxin was already hiding in the formation he had drawn. When a painting technique was cultivated to a high level, it was possible to open up a space in the void. For example, the 8 treasures ancient scroll left by the art saint opened up a space in the void. Using a Dao technique, he created something similar to a demon's palace. Currently, Li Yunxin's technique was not at such a high level. However, there were many magic treasures in his ring. Using one or a few of them along with other techniques, he could achieve a similar effect. But after hiding for a dozen breaths' time, he suddenly felt a shocking change between heaven and earth. This floating mountain also had spiritual energy, and it was astonishingly dense. If the spiritual energy in the mortal world was Qi, then the spiritual energy here could be called Qis. But such dense spiritual energy was firmly locked by a restriction, as if a large iron plate was pressing down on it. Originally, it was very difficult for it to move. But at this time, it was as if boiling hot water had suddenly splashed on it, corroding this Qis until it was full of holes. No matter what technique it was based on the local conditions and the surrounding environment. And when the environment of heaven and earth suddenly changed, the formation set up according to the environment also had a problem. Li Yunxin was originally in a scroll on the ground. But now, with a flash of light from the scroll, the formation was actually broken and he was expelled. He had never encountered such a situation before. So he was bewildered, afraid that he had fallen into some kind of trap. But in the next moment he also saw the black rain slowly falling from the sky. He had never seen such a thing before. But he was a cultivator and was far more sensitive to the changes in the Qi of heaven and earth than ordinary people. With just a glance he realized that these things were extremely dangerous. Chapter 519. Just when he had enough time to think about where these things came from and why they came here, he saw a figure. Someone was coming from behind the ruins in the north. Before Red Lady left the cloudy mountain, she blasted out a palm strike that was as powerful as breaking dry weeds and smashing rotten wood, destroying all the buildings along the way. As a result, all that was left of the palaces on the back were broken walls and only a few giant pillars were still standing. The figure walked slowly from behind the giant pillars. His footsteps were steady and his face was expressionless. It seemed that the black rain in the sky was just a drizzle to him and not worth his attention. However, his slightly stiff footsteps betrayed him. He obviously wanted to run away. He wanted to run, but he forced himself to walk slowly and mechanically, for fear that he would alarm something. Li Yunxin saw him and he saw Li Yunxin. The newcomer was dressed in gray, had blonde hair, a high nose and deep eyes. It was Grandmaster D. When they saw each other they were both shocked. Li Yunxin never thought that there would be someone else here. Grandmaster D also didn't expect that he would meet an intruder. However, Li Yunxin had practically killed her way out of dangerous situations these days. Her reaction was extremely fast. When he saw Grandmaster D, he frowned and was about to pounce on him. But when he was about to step forward, Grandmaster D suddenly shouted in a low voice after being stunned for a moment, "Don't move. Walk slowly." A thought flashed through Li Yunxin's mind. Did this person really have a reason for saying such words, or was he just bluffing to mislead her? But the next moment, the scene in front of him forced him to believe the former. His momentum suddenly increased and his spiritual power surged. Although it didn't burst out, it was ready to go. Because of this, the few black spots that were originally a distance away from his head suddenly sank down, reaching less than 2 feet in front of him. He was frightened by this thing. At this moment he was even more alarmed. Those black spots were like the craziest and most dangerous beasts in the world. They made him feel cold from the bottom of his heart and soaked his limbs and bones. Thus, he immediately dispersed his aura and did not dare to move even half a step. Only then did the black specks slowly sway and float away leisurely. At this moment, Grandmaster D said in a low voice while walking, "This thing is called Black Rain. It's the rain of the demon world. Once touched by it, even the body of the Grand Supreme Sage will be torn into pieces." After saying these few words, he was already less than a dozen steps away from Li Yunxin. His footsteps slowed down as he looked at Li Yunxin. "You should be a demon that killed its way in from outside the Cloud Mountain. Only you? Where are the others?" Now that they had appeared here and the floating mountain was in ruins, they were naturally the demons that had charged in from outside Cloud Mountain. However, Grandmaster D's identity was hard to guess. But in such a soul-stirring moment, guessing was not a wise move. Li Yunxin was a person who knew how to prioritize things. So she restrained her expression and said in a low voice, "They are all dead." Li Yunxin raised his hand and said, "You should stop. I don't know who you are, but I know that you and I are not on the same side. If you come any closer, even in this situation, I have to fight back to be safe." As for the second sage, he looked at Grandmaster D carefully. "He's still outside." As for the second saint, he looked at Grandpa D carefully. "He's still outside. But I think they are about to be defeated by us." Just as he had said, Grandpa D stopped walking. But he continued, "All right. Then let me tell you one thing, the black rain of the demon realm will not stop. In the end, it will connect and destroy Cloud Mountain and Cloud Mountain. It will also destroy the world. In the end they would join together. Not only would they destroy Little Cloud Mountain and Cloud Mountain, they would also destroy this world. What should I do?" Li Yunxin waved his hand and looked at him. "What should I do?" Li Yunxin waved her hand and looked at him. When he saw the demons appear on the floating mountain, he should have avoided them immediately. Seeing the demons appear on the floating mountain, he should have immediately avoided them and not let them see him. However, he knew how urgent the situation was. The three good-for-nothings had to follow him no matter how scared they were. Because there was a problem with the spiritual formation at the core of the mountain. When the mountain was moving in the sky, no one noticed the problem. For example, if a car was running on the road, the brakes might be broken. But if you didn't step on it, nothing would happen. But now that the mountain had fallen, the problem was obvious. However, the spiritual formation in the mountain had more than just the function of making the mountain move in the sky. Grandmaster D was not exaggerating. The appearance of the black spots was because of the problem with the spiritual formation. So he had to fix the spiritual formation. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. The three cowards knew this. So even if they were scared, they had to follow him. But now they were dead and he was the only one left. The situation was urgent. He didn't have time to go back and ask for help. He could only try to save the situation. At this moment he saw a living person on the floating mountain. It was a rare coincidence that only appeared once in 1,000 or 10,000 years. It was unknown whether it was good or bad luck. So, when Grandmaster D saw Li Yunxin, his first thought was not, "The demon broke into the mountain," but, "I have a helper." He didn't have time or mood to think about other things. At least he only had one goal. How could he make the demon believe him? The situation was urgent. If he couldn't help but fight, both of them would be finished. He had even thought of a few possibilities and prepared a few excuses in his mind. However, it was just 4 sentences. The demon asked him directly, "What should I do?" These 5 words stunned Di Gong slightly. This demon had a very clever mind and a very quick-witted heart. If his good-for-nothing companions had half of this demon's intelligence, they wouldn't have ended up in this situation. Previously he had gone straight to the point and went straight to the point. Now that he found out that Li Yunxin had an amazing ability to judge the situation, he couldn't help but ask, "Do you understand what I said? You want to solve the problem of the black rain, so you have to do something. But you need my help." "I understand." Li Yunxin looked at the black rain in the sky with a serious face. It was still falling very slowly. In fact, he didn't really believe in the so-called rain of the demon world. At least he didn't believe it. However, he could feel the fatal danger. This danger couldn't be avoided. It couldn't be delayed or solved by scheming. He had always been good at adapting to the situation. Thinking about other things at this time was no different from suicide. So he asked again, "But are you sure you can solve it?" Grandmaster D was stunned again. But this tiny emotion only lasted for a short moment before it disappeared. He nodded, "As long as you can help me. Follow me. Walk slowly." The expression on Grandmaster D's face didn't escape Li Yunxin's eyes. But he had seen it and that was all. He could not come to any other conclusion. He knew nothing about the person in front of him. It was impossible to infer other information from his expression and words. Thus, she followed his footsteps. Grandmaster D's destination was the Qi Hall. As soon as he entered, he saw the mess in the hall. But he didn't show any other expression. He just pushed aside a few things and walked inside. Those things were all carefully arranged by Li Yunxin before, and they were all set up with formations. Now that he pushed them aside easily, the limited spiritual power in them exploded uncontrollably, creating small electric arcs. However, when the electric arcs exploded on Grandmaster D's body, it was as if they exploded on a body of iron and stone. He didn't even frown. Although he didn't think of using these things to kill the two wandering souls, Li Yunxin was secretly shocked by this person's calmness. Such a strong body. At this moment, the roof of the Qi Hall cracked silently. The black spots had fallen. Some of them passed through the roof and floated in, while others absorbed the roof as well. No one knew what was going on. As a result, a startling light began to shine down on the two of them. Li Yunxin pinched the little finger of his left hand subconsciously. He followed him and asked in a low voice, "Who are you?" From what I can see, he looks somewhat familiar. Grandmaster D took 3 steps and said in a deep voice, "Since Cloud Mountain is the ancestral court of the Xianmen, there should be a guardian. Do you think there's no one here after the 2 sages left Cloud Mountain?" Li Yunxin thought for a while and said, "But you didn't show up just now." "Because I don't want to care about you kids," Grandmaster D said in a low voice. "What I want to care about is the survival of the human world." After saying this, he took 2 steps forward and said, "You set up these things in this hall to kill the 2 sages? How dare you? They're fake sages." Li Yunxin's footsteps paused and she tried to distance herself from him. "They're wandering souls. They're puppets of the Freemasons. You call yourself the guardian of Cloud Mountain. Don't you know that?" Grandmaster D stopped. Li Yunxin stopped as well. He tensed up to prevent any accidents. However, what he expected did not happen. The person in front of him lifted his foot and stomped on the ground a few times. The Qi Hall was not wide, but it was deep. Before it was used as a storeroom to store elixirs and artifacts, it must have had other uses because there was a high platform in the depths of the Qi Hall. If there were thrones on the high platform and civil and military officials on both sides, the Qi Hall would be like the main hall of an imperial palace. Now Grandmaster D walked under the high platform and stomped his foot. He didn't know what mechanism he had triggered. The high platform opened. Seeing this, Li Yunxin was shocked. He thought he had explored the entire Qi Hall and set up an ambush here. Who would have thought there was a hidden mechanism here? Chapter 520. But there was no mechanical sound when the platform was opened. There was no fluctuation of spiritual power either. If it was a mechanism, there should be a sound. If it was a formation, the Qi of heaven and earth should have changed. However, this high platform bounced up with a chong sound, and then split in half, revealing a bucket-sized hole. It seemed that there was no way to go here. However, Gong Di had crushed it with his stomp. Then he stooped down and, as if he were digging in some muddy pit, used his hand to pry the hole open as if to make it larger. He said, "If you want to kill them, it's your own business. If you can kill them here, it's your ability. For me, there is no difference between you and them." His tone was very arrogant, but he said it naturally. At this point, he finally tore open the hole, revealing a patch of white light underneath. At this time, the black spots fell lower and lower. 2 or 3 of them almost touched the top of Li Yunxin's head. Fortunately, he slowly moved to the side. Then he avoided them. But according to the current situation, he would not be able to avoid them even if he lay flat on the ground in a quarter of an hour. At this moment, Grandmaster D turned his head and looked at him. "Come." Then he jumped into the hole. In fact, if he thought about the current situation seriously, he might suspect that it was a trap set by the enemy. However, Li Yunxin also knew that the person who could make such a terrible thing to set up a trap didn't need to set up a trap. He did not hesitate. He walked over and took a look, then jumped down. In fact, there was another reason why he did this. It was said that there was a formation left by a celestial in Cloud Mountain. Now this person seemed to be heading for that formation. Li Yunxin wanted to see what that thing looked like. When he glanced outside the cave, he only saw that the ground inside was glowing with white light. It was not far away, only a few feet away. But when he jumped down, he realized that it was not the case. He fell for 5 or 6 breaths before his feet touched the ground. However, when his toes touched the ground, he felt a strong force pulling him down. But he soon realized that it was not some other force. It was a reversal of space. When he jumped down, the glowing ground was below him. Now that he had jumped down, the ground had become the ceiling. He immediately adjusted his posture, twisted his waist, and stood still. At this moment, he was in a narrow room. It was sealed without any doors or windows. It was about the size of a side room in the palace of Qi. The ceiling, as he saw it from the outside, was pressed very low. With his size, as long as he straightened his arms and stood on tiptoe, he would be able to touch it. And in the middle of this small room there was a cocoon. Cocoon was probably the only word that could describe that thing's appearance. It was as tall as a person and floated in the middle of the room. On the outside was a layer of oval light. Countless strands of light weaved together to form an outer shell. Inside was a ball of dark red light. He couldn't see its silhouette and appearance clearly, but he could see that it was slowly rotating as if it was alive. Li Yunxin opened his mouth but didn't say anything. He didn't know if this was the legendary spell formation left behind by a deva, or if it was the one that drove the entire Cloud Mountain. Grandpa D stood 3 steps away from him. He stared at the cocoon for a while and his face darkened. Li Yunxin followed his gaze and found a detail that he didn't notice just now. There was a crack on the cocoon. An extremely fine crack ran from top to bottom and penetrated through the outer layer. Although the outer layer was weaved by many flowing light rays, once it passed through the crack, the light would lose its color, as if the crack and the light did not exist in the same space, and the light had nothing to do with it. "You are Li Yunxin?" Grandpa D suddenly said. These 5 words made Li Yunxin purse her lips and sigh softly. "I didn't remember you before. But after seeing you today, I feel that I have underestimated you." Grandpa D didn't look at Li Yunxin when he spoke, but stared at the crack on the cocoon. It seemed that he was just chatting with him, as if he didn't take precautions against him and didn't mean any harm. "The people around me, the people I order around, none of them can compare to you." He reached out his hand to touch the crack. Li Yunxin saw that every time his finger touched the crack, it disappeared. It seemed that there was another space inside the crack. Then Grandpa D straightened his back and turned to look at Li Yunxin. "Do you want to work for me?" Li Yunxin frowned slowly. "You are?" He paused and said in a low voice, "An elder of the Freemasonry." After coming here, Grandpa D didn't seem to be very nervous. He didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, he looked at Li Yunxin and showed a faint smile. "I am a guardian." Li Yunxin thought for a while and said in a low voice, "You only met me once, but you feel that I am far better than all the people around you, so you come to recruit me. In my opinion, this is too perfunctory. You are surrounded by enemies on the Cloud Mountain. But when you saw me of unknown origin, you decided to help me after hearing only 4 sentences." Grandpa D shook his head. "There may be others with such insight and courage in the world. But you are the only one I have seen so far." "What? You don't believe me?" Li Yunxin laughed. "I'd be a fool if I believed you. If you are an elder of the Freemasonry, I have killed so many of you. Now I want to kill your right-hand man. How can I believe you at this time?" "You mean Su Yusong and Zhuomuzha?" Grandpa D thought for a while and raised his eyebrows. "Those 2 people are rebellious. They are useless. They have a grudge against you, so you can kill them if you want. They think I don't know that they want to establish themselves as kings. Humph, but I don't care." He seemed to be talking to himself in the last few sentences. But soon he focused his gaze on Li Yunxin. "I don't have to recruit you at this time. I want to talk to you, Li Yunxin. This thing is called the Cloud Mountain. It can move in the sky and guard the seam between the human world and the devil world at the same time. Now there is a problem with the core. I have to fix it, but I can't do it myself, so I need your help. But your current cultivation." Grandpa D looked him up and down. "It is far from enough. If I want you to help, I have to teach you a supernatural power. If you learn this supernatural power, you will become stronger and stronger. So, either I teach you or I take you. Or I teach you, use you, and then kill you. It's all up to you." Li Yunxin still looked at him with a frown. "You want to refine me into a wandering soul? I didn't know before. But after seeing you today, I feel that you are a hero," Grandpa D said seriously. "A hero cherishes a hero. So you don't have to be a wandering soul. You can join us, the Elders Guild." Li Yunxin was silent for a while. Then he said, "How much time do we have?" Grandpa D understood. "You can think about it for 5 minutes." 5 minutes. Li Yunxin repeated these 3 words softly and stopped talking. He started to pace slowly in the narrow room. 5 minutes later he stopped in his tracks. He exhaled and looked at Grandpa D, who had been waiting patiently. "Considering the situation in this room, I have thought about it seriously. But I feel that this is a difficult decision. In fact, I have been looking for you. He looked at Grandpa D. I want to ask 2 questions. If you can answer these 2 questions, I think it will help me to make up my mind, if I am as valuable to you as you say I am. Grandpa D nodded. Go ahead. A rare hesitant look appeared on Li Yunxin's face. But he only hesitated for 3 breaths. Li Yunxin said in a low voice, Is there a way to go back? After he said this, the room was silent for 3 breaths. Li Yunxin stared at Grandpa D without blinking. Grandpa D also stared at Li Yunxin. The 2 of them stared at each other for a long time. Then Grandpa D frowned. Where do you want to go? Li Yunxin looked at him. You know. However, it was obvious that Grandpa D did not know. A hint of doubt appeared on his face. He frowned as well. Since you are here, don't you know if you can go back or not? If Li Yunxin was a person who would write every emotion in her heart on her face, she would definitely not be able to hide it. Then he would definitely shout and stand on the spot in a daze. That was because Grandpa D's ambiguous answer had, in fact, answered 2 questions in his heart. First, they were indeed not from this world. At least, Grandpa D was not from this world. That was why he could understand his question of, is there a way to go back? However, second, Grandpa D's reaction was different from what Li Yunxin had expected. Grandpa D's reaction seemed to indicate that Grandpa D believed that Li Yunxin should know clearly if he could go back or not. This feeling of seeming to match but also having some deviation, he had felt it before. By Yanjun. After Li Yunxin defeated Fu Lifang in the Emperor Star Palace of Lord Dongting Mountain, Bai Yanjun had brought him to the underworld. Over there, the White Hell King had said something that he should have understood the moment he heard it. However, the troublesome thing was, Li Yunxin did not understand it. This seemed to imply that Bai Yanjun and the Black Yama King had once chosen a person to become a chosen one. Then they would help this chosen one, and ask him to do things for them. Li Yunxin knew that he was a transmigrator. Therefore, he had no qualms about becoming a chosen one. However, it was then that he realized, something must have gone wrong. Something must have gone wrong. Ita was not the chosen one. He could not understand Bai Yanjun's code, at all. He was a fake crown prince. Until now, this familiar feeling appeared once again. He could understand part of what Bai Yanjun had said, but not all of it. Grandpa D could also understand part of what he had said, but not all of it. This seemed to imply that Grandpa D, Bai Yanjun, they were people from the same world. And he was just an accident. An accident that was coincidentally involved in this. The long-lost and strong sense of danger appeared in his heart again. However, he was at his wit's end now. He could only hope that no one could see through this. This meant that he had to be very, very careful about anything related to this topic. Just now, Grandpa D's face had already revealed a suspicious look. He could not let anyone suspect him again. Especially Bai Yanjun. Chapter 521. Therefore, he suppressed his emotions and exhaled softly, I'm just a little regretful. The same ambiguous sentence. Grandmaster D could understand many meanings in his heart. But Li Yunxin didn't give him more time to think and immediately asked his second question. Then my second question is, he paused, I heard that your Freemasonry believes that there will be a great calamity in the world. You're not ignorant people in the secular world. Since you said so, you must think it's true. What is the great calamity? This question made Grandmaster D put away the doubt on his face. He thought for a moment and said calmly, the great calamity is the invasion of the devil realm. After saying this, he raised his hand and pointed above his head. That black rain is the rain of the devil realm, full of devil chi. Devil chi is like the spiritual power of the devil realm. It nourishes all living things in the devil realm, but it's fatal to us. The crack between the human realm and the devil realm is getting bigger and bigger, and sooner or later, Mount Yun won't be able to hold it. At that time, the gate between the devil realm and the human realm will open, and the great calamity will come. And what we need to do is to deal with it. In this inevitable calamity, we need to preserve the tinder of humanity. This explanation sounded reasonable. For the people of this world. But Li Yunxin was silent for a while and said in a low voice, I know what 5 minutes means. Before this, Grandmaster D used a word, 5 minutes. Li Yunxin knew what 5 minutes meant. This meant that, at least in some aspects, he had similar experiences with Grandmaster D. This also meant that other than using words like devil realm and humanity, which were easier for the natives of this world to understand, they could also use other ways to communicate. If the man in front of him wanted to. However, Grandmaster D snorted, which seemed to be a mixture of snort and hum, and then said, "That's all I can say. So, have you thought it through?" When Li Yunxin was about to speak, Grandmaster D said, "It's okay if you haven't. Take your time to think. Settle the matter in front of you first. I'll teach you that magical power now." Li Yunxin was shocked and stunned for a moment. It was not a pleasant surprise, but more of bewilderment. This person called himself a guardian, but he was undoubtedly an elder of the Freemasons. He needed Lin Li's help for this matter, and he seemed to be interested in Lin Li's talent and wanted to recruit him. However, he also made it clear that the divine ability he was going to impart to him was extremely powerful. Once he learned it, he would either be used by him or die. Li Yunxin therefore asked him 2 questions to help him make a decision. However, when he asked the first question, this person seemed to be suspicious, but there was nothing abnormal about it. He asked the second question. But this person only said a bunch of things like Devil World and Devil Chi. Thus, Li Yunxin reminded him that he was not a native of this world, nor was he an ignorant person. He thought that there would be another round of probing. However, she did not know what she had said wrong, nor did she know what this person was thinking. He seemed to have quickly lost interest in her and was not even willing to speak anymore. Everything happened in the span of 2 or 3 breaths. What did she say wrong? However, Li Yunxin knew almost nothing about this person, and the information he could obtain was too little. He could not come to any definite conclusion. Thus he frowned. Up to you?" Grandmaster D only said one sentence, then he raised one hand and breathed a long breath on his palm with his mouth. The narrow room was not cold, but Grandmaster D's breath turned into frost. The white fog gathered in his palm, and quickly condensed into a small ice crystal. It looked like a date pit. Ordinary date pits had lines and grooves on them, and this ice crystal also had them. They were some fine dark lines. His method was like the magic of gods in the eyes of mortals, but even Li Yunxin felt a little scared. The restriction on the floating mountain prohibited divine abilities, but this person could still make such a change. This was not a good thing. But the next moment he frowned again, because the lines on the ice crystal were slowly changing. At first they were faint lines, but they quickly spread. In just one breath, the whole ice crystal turned gray. Grandmaster D held it in his palm and handed it to Li Yunxin, saying calmly, "Eat it." What a joke. Let's not talk about the origin of this thing. One breath ago it was in someone else's mouth, and one breath later, it was being eaten by him. Li Yunxin stared. What is this? When Grandmaster D handed it to him and he asked this question, the change on the ice crystal continued. Its color became darker, and soon only a gloomy black was left. Black which blocked and absorbed all light. This black crystal was very similar to the black spots they saw outside. In other words, it was exactly the same. Li Yunxin took a step back and asked again, "What is this?" Grandmaster D looked at him impatiently. Without saying a word, he flipped his palm and flicked it. This black crystal immediately shot towards Li Yunxin like lightning. It should be known that this was a narrow room. The distance between Li Yunxin and Grandmaster D was only 6 or 7 steps. It was an exaggeration to say that the black crystal was as fast as lightning, but it was still faster than a bow and arrow. Li Yunxin's reaction was not slow. He raised his hand to block it. However, the black crystal passed through his palm without any hindrance. He had never encountered such a thing before, so it was too late to react. Although he closed his mouth, the black crystal went straight into his mouth. Immediately he felt a frightening chill. In fact, Li Yunxin did not know whether it was a chill or not. Once the black crystal entered his mouth, it seemed to turn into a ball of cold flame and flowed into his meridians. Then it went against the circulatory circle and attacked his snow mountain and ocean of chi. Whether it was a cultivator or a demon, the meridians, snow mountain and ocean of chi were extremely important and secretive things. How could it be invaded by foreign things? Without waiting for Li Yunxin to react, the demonic energy in his body had already surged up, pouncing towards the slivers of invading cold flames like a stormy sea. However, the vigorous demonic power hit nothing. Li Yunxin raised his hand to block it. His hands and feet were solid, so he might not be able to block the black crystal. But now that the black crystal had rushed into his body, the vigorous demonic power in his body was not solid, so he could not block it. The cold flame also passed through the demonic power and went straight into his snow mountain and ocean of chi. At this moment, Li Yunxin finally realized what was going on. He spat and stared at Grandpa D. "What's this?" Grandmaster D looked at him calmly and said 2 words, "Demonic seed." Demonic seed. Li Yunxin had only heard these 2 words a few times, but most of the time she had heard them on Cloud Mountain. That wandering soul Su Yusong had explained it to him in detail, and now, this Freemason elder mentioned it again. Besides, if what he said was true, he actually implanted this so-called demonic seed into his body? Was this the magical power he said he would teach him? Li Yunxin was shocked and confused. He was about to ask again, but his expression froze. He froze on the spot. When Su Yusong told him about the demonic seed, he said that it only existed in the bodies of demons. However, the painting Saint Chenjiao also had it. Now that Li Yunxin was a demon, he naturally had a demonic seed. But although he was said to have a demonic seed in his body, Li Yunxin had never sensed it in his body. Cultivators and demons were not ordinary people in the market. They did not even know what was in their skin. When cultivators reached a certain level, they could introspection. This so-called introspection did not mean that one could really see what was inside one's body. As for the meridians and acupoints, they didn't mean that there were tubes and spaces in the body. Even the snow mountain and ocean of qi did not mean that there was a sea and a mountain floating on the sea. These things were more about a certain state and characteristic. If one was not a cultivator and had never experienced this, it would be impossible to explain it. For example, no matter what, humans could not understand what the colors were that birds could recognize more than humans. Therefore, when Li Yunxin set up arrays in the city of Wei, he set up arrays that represented his meridians and meridians. The shape of the array might not look like a human. After that, he set up arrays in the wild forest. But naturally, the wild forest could not exactly have the shape of a human. The arrays he set up there only moved according to the qi dynamic, and did not draw a human shape. This was to say that cultivators could introspection. This introspection was to collect the essence, qi and spirit, and observe the qi dynamic between the spirit and the body. Through this method of introspection, they gained an understanding of their own internal organs that was far beyond what could be achieved through seeing. Not to mention whether there were any foreign bodies in the body, they could even control which parts of the body were damaged, how they were damaged, whether they could be repaired or not, and whether they should temporarily melt the part and regenerate it. Because of this, Li Yunxin knew every corner of his body. He clearly knew, at least he thought he knew, that there was no extra space in his body for a demon seed. But today at this moment, the reason why he suddenly froze was because he saw the demon seed. There seemed to be a secret writing paper hidden in his body. Words were written in a special way on the paper and could only be seen by special means. His body was this paper. Everything he had experienced before, including the demonic power, was clearly written on this piece of paper. As for the demon seed in his body that Su Yusong mentioned, it was the secret writing in a special way. It had been hidden before and he did not even realize it. But now, the Freemasonry elder put another demon seed in his body. The secret writing, the demon seed hidden in his body, was finally revealed. After the cold flame finally invaded the snow mountain and ocean of qi, there seemed to be something in Li Yunxin's body suddenly opened up, something that had been sealed in the past. Now that he encountered this cold flame, the seal was removed. As mentioned before, the so-called inner vision was not really seeing what was in the body. But now, at this very moment, Li Yunxin actually saw a tiny human figure in her body with an unknown eye. It seemed to be in his brain, near the Baihui acupoint. Suddenly, a grayish space appeared. And in the middle of this space there was a small person. The distance was too far so he could not see it clearly. He could only vaguely make out that there were limbs and a head. All of this happened in an instant. The next moment, the space and the small person disappeared in a flash. The cold flame that had invaded his body completely covered them. The cold flame rotated slowly and finally turned into a deep darkness. In this darkness there was no light or sound, and it seemed like even the rules did not exist. What was this thing? What the hell was this elder of the Freemasons? How could he make this thing? Li Yunxin was shocked. But Elder D was still calm. He only glanced at his reaction, then turned his face back to the cocoon in front of him and said, "Demon seed. This thing can give you some supernatural powers? Natural supernatural powers? You don't need to cultivate them. The reason why all the demons in this world are born with supernatural powers is because of this demon seed. You're also a demon now. But you, this demon, is not your original body. Your demon seed is the dragon's gray seed. All the demons in the world are gray seeds. You saw it just now, right? It's just a gray patch. But what I gave you is a black seed." Hearing this, Li Yunxin immediately frowned. He was indeed surprised to suddenly see the original demon seed in his body. But now, listening to this person's words, he actually explained to him what a demon seed was. This seemed to mean that Su Yusong did not pass on the conversation between him and Li Yunxin in Chen Zhao's study to this elder. Maybe, at that time, the wandering souls thought that Li Yunxin was already a dead man and felt that such a small matter did not need to be reported, so this elder did not know. This speculation made him feel at ease. Since meeting this guardian until now, although it was only a short time, the amount of information revealed in their conversation was huge. Also, during this time the other party seemed to have learned a lot about Li Yunxin while Li Yunxin knew nothing about him. He had been at a disadvantage while Elder D always had the initiative. It was as if everything was under his control, so he was calm. And the method of inserting the demon seed into Li Yunxin's body made him suffer an unprecedented loss. Ever since he started his cultivation he had encountered many strong enemies, but he always had a way to deal with them. It had never been like today. He had been forced to eat the thing that the other party had just exhaled. But now this speculation made Li Yunxin realize that no matter what the reason was, this guardian was not omniscient and omnipotent. The demon seed in your body is just a patch of gray. But what Li Yunxin saw was not just a patch of gray. This guardian also had things that he did not know. Chapter 522. Di Gong saw Li Yunxin's frown. But he thought of something else. A faint smile flashed across his face. It was hard to tell if it was a sneer. Afraid of something? You should be afraid. As he said this, he slowly reached out to touch the crack on the cocoon. Previously he touched it to test the waters. This time it seemed like he was really going to make a move. But his tone and expression made Li Yunxin surprised. When this person first saw Li Yunxin, his expression and words were normal. He could even be called polite. Although it was not appropriate to describe him as courteous, it was not far off. But not long ago his attitude suddenly changed. Now it was no different from how the wandering souls and cultivators treated Li Yunxin. It was as if he used to think that Di Fui was an important person, but now he felt that Di Fui was not important. Li Yunxin could not figure out why, so he stopped thinking about it. He carefully observed the changes in his body. This person said that the demon seed in the demon's body was the gray seed. He must be referring to the patch of gray that Li Yunxin saw in a glimpse, which was next to the pitch-black little person. He also said that he gave Li Yunxin the black seed. From his words, the black seed was more powerful than the gray seed. But based on Li Yunxin's current experience, what that person said did not seem to be false. Li Yunxin felt that he had become stronger. He had mastered more Taoist techniques and supernatural powers. It could be said that he had become stronger. The spiritual and demonic powers in his body had become denser. It could be said that he had become stronger. However, he felt that he had become stronger, but it did not seem to be these two things. He had become stronger in essence. It was just like how martial artists in the secular world also had inner strength in martial arts. But now, this person's body suddenly became stronger. Naturally, his inner strength and martial arts were also strengthened. His current situation was similar, but not the same. He had never experienced such a strange feeling. He could not describe it in words. But the most direct experience was that when he was fighting with the golden light, he had advanced from the realm of enlightened Jinren to the realm of advanced Jinren. This was the second stage of the true realm. Now this person had injected the black seed into his body. Although his demonic power was still suppressed by the restriction in Little Cloud Mountain, he could already feel that the demonic power in his body had become stronger. This strength far surpassed the level that a perfected enlightened master should have. If he were to boldly speculate, he would say that he had already crossed the perfected enlightened master realm and stepped into the last stage of the true state, the perfected harmony master realm. But this was really strange. The spirit chi on Cloud Mountain was indeed rich. However, the amount of demonic energy that a perfected being could contain was quite considerable. After Li Yunxin was reborn, the demonic power in his body was almost exhausted. First, he ate about 70 to 80% of the immortal fruits on the floating mountain. Then he ate a lot of pills that he plundered from the palace of Qi. Only then did he manage to recover 50 to 60% of his demon power. As for the pills in the Qi palace, what were they? It was a treasure that had been accumulated by the celestial sect for tens of thousands of years. A pill that could take years, decades, or even hundreds of years to be formed. How powerful was the spiritual power contained in it? However, these things only helped him recover half of his strength. It could be seen that even if he was in the perfected enlightened master realm, the amount of spiritual power he needed was enormous. However, he seemed to have directly jumped from the perfected enlightened master realm to the perfected harmony master realm. If the amount of spiritual power required in this period was supplemented with pills, he would probably have to eat all the pills in the Qi Palace, eat again, and eat again for the third time to barely have enough. In such a short period of time, the amount of spiritual power in Little Cloud Mountain was naturally not that much. However, in his body, the black seed had forcibly raised his realm. It was as if he was originally a bucket that could hold 10 caddies of water, but only 5 caddies. Now there was not much water, but the bucket had been forcibly raised. What exactly was this black seed, to have such a terrifying effect? At this moment, Gong Di continued to say, I know that you once guided the power of faith into your body in the city of Wei. He must be referring to the time when Li Yunxin was chased and his ocean of qi and mountain of snow was sealed by the talisman puppet. As a last resort, he could only guide the power of faith into his body in order to break through the inhibition. At that time, Li Yunxin was not very clear that people could not use the power of faith and he almost died. It was also because he knew that he would die that he took the risk to plot against the 9th young master and Lu Ling. But do you know why people can't use the power of faith? Li Yunxin was slightly stunned. Of course he had thought about this question. The answer to the question was that the ocean of qi and mountain of snow of cultivators were like a rock. And the power of faith was like sand. If sand was mixed into the rock, the structure would naturally be unstable. If too much was mixed, the ocean of qi and mountain of snow would collapse. Once this thing collapsed, people would naturally die. But Li Yunxin was clear that this was not what he was asking. It was a deeper reason, why the ocean of qi and mountain of snow were like a rock, and the power of faith was like sand? Gong Di did not want to hear his answer. He continued to say, it's because of the demon seed. There is a gray seed in the body of a demon, so the power that can be used is very mixed. Without the gray seed in the body of a human, they can only use spiritual power. As for now, I've planted a black seed in your body. It's even worse than your gray seed. He paused and glanced at Li Yunxin. When there was no gray seed in your body, the introduction of the power of faith would cause your life to be in danger. Now that there is a black seed in your body, it's similar to the situation at that time, you probably can't bear the power of the black seed. His words were muffled. But Li Yunxin roughly understood what he meant. When he was a human he could not use the exclusive power of a demon. But now he was a demon. But for a demon, the power of the black seed was like the power of a demon to a human. So now you've become stronger. You can help me clean up the mess now. Gong Di continued to look at him. But once this matter is over, you should think about whether you want to die or be used by me. Li Yunxin frowned and looked at him. After thinking for 2 breaths he said, Did I say something that offended you? Gong Di was a smart man. He knew what Li Yunxin was asking. Why did his attitude suddenly change from respectful to arrogant? He still gave a vague snort. I suddenly realized that you are not the person I'm looking for. Now do something. Help me hold this thing open. This sentence made Li Yunxin's heart skip a beat. His speculation seemed to have been confirmed. He was not the person Bai Yanjun was looking for. And now this person thought he was also the person he was looking for, but, because of one or a few of his words he was also disappointed. Did this mean that Bai Yanjun and this person were both looking for the same person or the same kind of person? But at this moment he saw that Gong Di's hands had already reached into the black crack on the cocoon. It seemed that Gong Di had fumbled inside for a while, then exerted some strength to slightly expand the crack. The walls, floor and ceiling of this room had originally been emitting a faint white light. But now that the crack had been expanded, red light immediately shone out. The red light seemed to be emitted by the thing inside the cocoon, and that thing seemed to have a life of its own, dancing wildly. For a moment the room turned from bright white to dark red, as if there were many demons and ghosts wandering around, looking like a domain. Li Yunxin hesitated for a while but finally walked over. No matter what had happened just now, he believed in his previous judgment, that the black rain was extremely dangerous. Many things could be discussed later, but this matter had to be solved first. This so-called guardian was also sure that he would recognize this reality, so his attitude was so fearless. In the past, Li Yunxin was not afraid of death because there were many things that had to be done when the arrow was knocked on the bow. That was why he explored dangerous situations unrestrainedly and insisted on fighting against the heavens. But now, if he were to perish together with this person just because of this person's disrespectful attitude, he did not care about the death of others, but he himself would die with grievance, and no one would know about his heroic reputation. He was not willing to do this kind of business. In the past he was the one who caused others to suffer in silence, but he did not expect that he would fall into such a trap. He looked at Grandpa D's meaning and guessed that he should take over and continue to open the crack. Now that things had come to this, there was no point in thinking too much. Moreover, he was half a cat, so he was extremely curious, and wanted to see what the formation set by the legendary celestial being looked like. So he stretched out his hands. As expected. When his hands were about to touch the crack, Grandpa D said to him in a deep voice, "Use your demon power." In the past, in this Mount Shaoyin, demon power could be used in the body, but it could not be fully used. Now that he heard this, Li Yunxing tried to use his snow mountain and ocean of qi, but it was good. Originally his power was confined. But now, the black seed had invaded the snow mountain and ocean of qi, and that place was originally covered by the cold flame. When he used his power again, the cold flame instantly mixed with the demon power and ran a big circle. Then, it gushed out from every meridian and aperture, as if it was plated with a layer of outer shell for Li Yunxing. It was hard to see with the naked eye, but the most direct observation was that Li Yunxing's hands were holding the crack, because of the layer of cold flame that covered his whole body. When he held it, Grandpa D let go. Instantly he felt an extremely strong force coming. The crack was about to close. It was as if he was holding two mountains and the force was endless, not even giving him a chance to breathe. Li Yunxing's heart skipped a beat. He saw that Grandpa D opened the crack effortlessly, but he felt that he could not even hold it for 2 breaths. How strong was Grandpa D exactly? At this moment, Grandpa D shouted, "Open!" It was easy for him to open it, but it was difficult for Li Yunxing to do it. It was more than difficult. With his current ability, it was impossible. However, at the moment when he used up all his strength and the crack was about to close, Grandpa D shouted again, "Come!" Because of this shout, 10 red light spots of different sizes suddenly flew out from the crack that was about to close. These light spots seemed to be created by some magic, and each of them was in the shape of a hexagon with distinct edges and corners. Once they arrived in front of Grandpa D, they immediately lined up in a circle and stopped 3 feet in front of him. At this moment the crack was about to close. But Grandpa D raised his hand and his fingers were like the wind. He pointed at the 10 light spots for more than 10 times. Every time his fingers touched the light spots shone brightly. It was as if the formation was responding to the spiritual power in his hands, and the light shone brightly. At this moment, Li Yunxing's attention was focused on the crack, and he did not pay much attention to Grandpa D's actions. But he also noticed that Grandpa D's fingers were very orderly, and should be following some kind of pattern. It was more like he was setting up a formation. After he pointed at the light spots for more than 10 times, he shouted again in a low voice, "Hold it in." Before Li Yunxing could understand what he meant, he suddenly felt as if an electric current had passed through his body. The cold flames that were emitted by the black seeds circulated on the surface of his body, forming a shell. Now it felt as if something had been mixed into the cold flames, and with a loud boom, it had expanded him. This bigger did not mean that his body had become bigger. It was more like his perception and strength had become bigger. It was as if he had become a balloon, and now someone blew a big breath of air into his body, causing him to suddenly swell up. Cultivators always understood their own bodies very well. When did they ever have such a strange and indescribable feeling? Even though Li Yunxing was worried about the black rain, he was also shocked at this moment. He wanted to let go of his hand and hide to the side to get rid of this strange feeling. But it was too late. His body was no longer under the control of his own consciousness. He wanted to retract his hand and escape, but his hands suddenly exerted force. The newly obtained terrifying power suddenly opened the crack that previously made him feel as heavy as a mountain. As soon as the crack opened, it immediately revealed the flowing red light inside. It was originally a black line, but now it was expanded into the shape of a jujube seed. It looked like, it was as if a blood-red eye suddenly opened, and there were many eyeballs that were emitting red light in this eye. Seeing this terrifying scene, even though Li Yunxing was a demon and had seen many things, he could not help but be shocked. But this was not the most shocking thing. The moment the cocoon was torn open, a soundless, but extremely sharp hissing sound exploded. It exploded in the cocoon, in the room, and also in his body, spirit, and the entire space. It was as if a hurricane that could destroy the heavens and extinguish the earth was attacking him, and his soul and body were like a withered tree in the wilderness of this hurricane. The strong wind blew against his face, and his thin body could not protect his spirit at all, so, there was a buzzing sound in his consciousness. Li Yunxing's vision suddenly widened. It was as if that sharp hissing sound had shaken his spirit out of his body, and in just a moment he did not know how far it had flown. If his spirit was really blown away, Outside this narrow room was the Palace of Qi, outside the Palace of Qi was the floating mountain, and outside the floating mountain was the little cloud mountain and the cloud mountain. He should have been able to see this scene. But now his vision suddenly widened, and he saw that Grandpa D turned his head and said something to his body, then raised his hand and pointed at the spot of light. Suddenly he fell into a void. However, this void was not completely empty. If one looked carefully, there seemed to be countless stars moving, as if they were dancing in a pot of boiling water. This moment was very short, but in his consciousness, it seemed to be very long. However, Li Yunxin's thoughts also became slow, and he could not think of any valuable ideas in a short time. Then the void suddenly disappeared and there was a chaotic scene in front of him. Li Yunxin finally saw something that could be understood. Now he did not know whether the him at this moment was a spirit or something else. But if he had a body, his eyes would definitely be wide open at this moment. Because he saw a familiar person. The scene in front of him was a boiling Red Sea. It was as if the ground was covered with lava, and there was no place for him to step. In this sea of lava, there were countless things that looked like humans, but their faces could not be seen clearly, jumping out and falling back. It was as if many small people formed by lava wanted to get rid of this sea of lava, but were always unable to do so. But this was not what surprised him. What surprised him was that there was a long spear in this sea of lava. The reason why he knew it was a spear was because the spear's head was facing up, inserted in the sea of lava. And it was very big. It was so big that the spear's shaft was as thick as half an adult man's body. And the reason why he knew this was because there was indeed a person pierced through the spear. That person was dressed in black. His tongue was very long, hanging down and stuck to the spear shaft. He was pierced through by the spear, as if someone had stabbed him to death, and then placed his corpse here to show others. So his eyes were wide open and did not close even in death. Li Yunxin did not have much contact with him, but he recognized him. Black Yama King. Chapter 523. Was this a dream? Cultivators were clear-minded and rarely dreamed. The few dreams that Li Yunxin had in this life were all due to special reasons. But if it was not a dream, he could not believe what he was seeing. The Black Yama King was dead. What about Bai Yanjun? Where was this place? Could it be the Sanluo Temple? Just like when he was traversing through the void earlier. It was a very short time, but it felt like a long time had passed. These thoughts only spun in his head for a second before the scene in front of him changed horribly. All of a sudden, all the flaming figures that jumped out of the boiling magma opened an eye at the same time. This eye opened in the middle of the figure's body and almost occupied the entire torso. It emitted a red glow and looked very much like the thing in the cocoon that Grandpa D asked him to tear open. They stared at Li Yunxin at the same time, causing him to feel numb all over. Then he heard a neat, wind-like scream. "Save me." The sharp scream was like a fierce wind sweeping through the gap, almost piercing one's eardrums. Li Yunxin had a splitting headache. He felt as if every inch of his skin was being cut by a sharp knife. His consciousness shrank violently. Everything in front of him flew far away. After that long and short void, he returned to the narrow room. At this time he saw Grandpa D's fingers still jumping on the 10 light spots. But the thing in the cocoon looked completely different. There were countless red lights flowing before, but now the red lights had completely dissipated. Only a shiny iron ball was left. It was extremely smooth and its surface faithfully reflected everything in the narrow room, including his slightly panicked face. Li Yunxin's hands were still holding the crack. But now that he regained control of his body, he immediately stopped and jumped 2 steps back. "What did you do to me?" But there was no need for him to hold it anymore. The crack didn't close up but slowly disappeared. It was as if an invisible hand had zipped up the shiny iron ball and wrapped it up again. "You're done here." Grandmaster D's fingers danced on the light spots for the last few times before he clenched his fist and pounded heavily on the ring that was surrounded by 10 light spots. Thus, they all turned into streams of light and disappeared into the void. Then he turned to look at Li Yunxin. "What did you see?" Li Yunxin hesitated for a moment. Instead of answering, he asked, "What is this?" He raised his hand and pointed at the cocoon. "Is this the formation left by the celestial being?" The reason why he asked this was because he was too familiar with the appearance of the eye on the cocoon. It was the same as the eye on the little people that leaped out of the magma sea. He was astonished by it. Perhaps he knew nothing of what he had been through before. But at least it was still within common sense. He didn't know, but he could guess. But now, what he had seen and experienced could no longer be judged by common sense. Since he didn't answer, Gongzi Di didn't seem to want to ask any more. The elder of the Freemasons let out a long breath. His expression had already relaxed. He looked at Li Yunxin up and down. It seems that you really don't know. Judging from his tone, it seemed that Li Yunxin should know. Since you don't know, you don't have to say more. So, do you want to go with me? Li Yunxin hesitated for a moment. Grandmaster Di sneered. Then forget it. As for the demons outside, their doomsday is coming. Saying this, he clapped his hands and shouted in a low voice, "It's open." The originally bright white cocoon closed up and was spinning slowly. Now that it heard these two words, it immediately sped up. In just a moment, it turned into a ball of light, illuminating the room as if it were daytime. Then Grandmaster Di shook his head. "I thought you were a promising person. But unfortunately we are not the same kind of people. If you say that this thing is a formation left by the celestial being, it is true. In fact, the black seed I put into your body can be regarded as something from the celestial being. But, since it is something from the celestial being, you should use the power of the celestial being. Mortals don't have the chance to experience the power of the celestial being. But today you will probably have the honor. In a moment it would fill the room. The black seed in your body is like a new snow mountain and ocean of chi. It will guide the spiritual power into it." Grandmaster Di paused and laughed. "But it is also like, your previous body introduced the power of wish. You have no way to digest this power. You will probably die from bloating. Li Yunxin, enjoy the feeling of being a powerhouse." After saying this, he suddenly took a step back. Although Li Yunxin didn't understand, he knew that the words he left behind were not good. Now that things had come to this, even if there was a huge difference in strength between them, how could he let him go? With a muffled groan, he raised his hand to catch him. However, when Grandmaster Di took a step back, he suddenly hit the wall. Then, as if the wall was made of water, his whole body sank into it. Escaping through the wall was not a brilliant technique. Li Yunxin could use it easily. However, now that he was on Mount Shaoyin, it was impossible for him to use this magical power again. His fingers didn't manage to catch Grandmaster Di but touched the wall. With a bang, the whole room buzzed, but the wall didn't break. When Grandmaster Di hid, the wall was as solid as water. But when Li Yunxin touched it, it was indestructible. His heart tightened. If the wall of this narrow room couldn't be broken, wouldn't he be trapped alive in here? Therefore, without any hesitation, he raised his hand and punched again. This time, the strength of the punch was even greater. A deafening roar reverberated through the entire room, causing his bones to buzz and the surface of his fists to almost crack. But because of this, Li Yunxin was stunned. He didn't punch for the third time. Because the second punch was too powerful. Previously, he wanted to catch Grandmaster Di, so he naturally had to use all his strength. However, the strength of his first punch with all his strength was only half of this second punch. When the second punch was used, even with his strong demon body, he still felt pain on his fist. It showed how powerful it was. This meant, Li Yunxin slowly turned around, took a deep breath, and looked at the room that had turned into a ball of flowing light. When Grandmaster Di left, he didn't feel anything. But now, only 3 breaths had passed. Terrifying power was released from the cocoon continuously. Therefore, at this moment, Li Yunxin realized that when they came in, this thing should have stopped spinning. And now it was the way it should be. Before Grandmaster Di left, he said that the power contained in this cocoon or core was the spiritual power used by Deva. And the black seed in Li Yunxin's body was like the snow mountain and ocean of chi that could absorb this spiritual power. It would continuously absorb this power into his body, and he would become stronger and stronger until he exploded. This statement was scary enough. But it was scary on the basis that Grandmaster Di's prediction was correct. He said that there was only a gray seed in Li Yunxin's body, but he didn't know that there was a black human figure in his body. Although he couldn't see it with his inner vision, Li Yunxin could clearly remember the scene at that time. The so-called gray race and black race might sound clueless and hard to understand. But Li Yunxin felt that it was just a different way of saying another power system. It looked scary, strange, and unfathomable, but once it was sorted out, maybe it was still within the scope of his understanding. For example, among the mortal warriors, there was also talk about the conception and governing vessels and the chi circulation. If the spiritual power of the cultivators was poured into their bodies, they would also explode and die. But if one understood the method of cultivation and slowly understood the principles behind it, he would find that in essence, there was no difference between the cultivation of the mortal warriors. They all used various methods to refine their essence, chi and spirit. Since Grandmaster Di compared the black seed to the snow mountain and ocean of chi, it meant that the two must have something in common. As long as he could find something in common, he might be able to escape. After calming himself down, he dared to carefully observe the cocoon. When Grandmaster D was here, he carefully restrained his mind to prevent any unexpected problems. Only now did he have the mood to study this thing again. If this was the magic array left by the celestial beings, what Grandmaster D did to this magic array just now was to repair this thing. Although it looked like he only touched some spots of light, it was definitely not as easy as it looked. There were many red lights in the cocoon. The red lights looked very strange at first, but now that he thought about it, it felt a little familiar. Li Yunxin had always been a very smart person. If something felt familiar to him, he would definitely be able to think of the source. But now, he couldn't think of what he had seen that made him feel familiar. Perhaps it was because, after seeing the red lights in the cocoon, he was inexplicably shaken to the place where the Black King of Hell died by the scream. Then he saw even more unbelievable and incomprehensible scenes and more similar eyes. That was why he couldn't distinguish it. However, after he tried to touch it with his divine sense for a while, he realized that this cocoon was not something that he could pry into. Now the room was filled with majestic spiritual power. It was as if there were 10,000 experts at the peak of the Grand Supreme Realm trapped in this cocoon, desperately releasing an extremely oppressive aura in all directions. And these spiritual powers and auras were desperately drilling into his body. Previously, Grandmaster D said that his power was not enough to help, so he inserted the black seed into his body. He forcefully pushed his realm to the last level of the true state, the perfect harmony realm. Now he was like an empty bucket. The spiritual power overflowed in the room and flowed into his bucket. When he punched the second time, the power was so strong that he couldn't bear it. It was because the spiritual power in his body had skyrocketed, and he couldn't digest it in time. After all, he was a dragon. He wasn't an animal that first gained spiritual intelligence and then cultivated the Tao fruit. If one were to look into it, it was not appropriate to classify dragons as any of the three types of demons. However, if one had to say they were somewhat similar to ghost cultivators, the true bodies of dragons, the god-fiend bodies, and the incarnations were actually condensed from demonic power. Therefore, when his realm increased, his body should also be remodeled. Only when the endlessly surging demonic power in his body was remodeled into a more powerful dragon body would the upgrade and transformation be completed. However, now that he was in Mount Shaoyin, his supernatural power was restricted. At this moment, there was no way for him to reveal his god-fiend body or true body to complete this remodeling. Therefore, although his body contained a terrifying amount of spiritual energy, his physical body wasn't strong enough to match this spiritual power. Grandmaster D was right. If he was a cultivator, his realm would be forcefully raised, and he absorbed so much spiritual energy in a short period of time. If he didn't have enough time to slowly temper his physical body, he would explode at any moment. However, he was a demon and his body was extremely strong. He could hold on for a while longer than an ordinary person. Even so, he soon felt the scorching heat. This heat came from both the divine soul and the physical body. This was the sign of the overload of spiritual power in his body. The spiritual power suddenly had nowhere to go, so it repeatedly surged in his body. It made him feel that he had all the power in his body but nowhere to vent it. He really wanted to smash something. And all this happened within the time of 5 breaths. However, the most terrible thing was that this kind of power that even perfected Jinren Li Yunxin couldn't withstand seemed to be just a little bit of insignificant power that escaped from the cocoon when it was spinning at high speed. This thing. If it was really an array left by a celestial, how strong would it be? However, after another 3 breaths, Li Yunxin really felt that something was wrong. He originally thought that Grandmaster D only calculated that there was a gray seed in his body, but not that human form. Therefore he felt that this was a variable and he could slowly find a way to deal with it. Even if he couldn't find it, he could go out first and think about it later. His little finger contained so many treasures in the Xianmen, how could he not be able to protect himself temporarily? He didn't expect things to happen so fast. He was shocked because of this. After all, the spiritual power in his body had surged to the extreme and reached the peak of the realm of truth. He raised his fist and punched the wall. However, the wall didn't move at all. Instead, the sound waves caused by the punch made him bleed from all his orifices. What the hell is this thing? It doesn't have any spells, but it can't even break the dragons at the peak of the realm of truth. How can there be such a tough person in the world? In a hurry, he punched 5 more times. Every punch was with all his strength, and it was also to vent the spiritual power in his body. This could temporarily alleviate the crisis in his body, and it finally had some effect. The wall was punched and a small crack appeared. Within the crack, there were inconspicuous, extremely tiny fragments that flew everywhere due to the tremendous force. At that moment, Li Yunxin was so anxious that he couldn't have noticed that there were a few pieces that shot towards the cocoon like arrows after being shaken up by the tip of his fist. The crack that Li Yunxin punched out was very small and so were the pieces. The biggest one was only a speck of dust. Therefore, once it entered the ball of light, it disappeared without a trace as if it had never been there. And the light cocoon continued to spin. It only paused slightly and the strong light in the room flickered slightly. But Li Yunxin couldn't notice this degree of flickering. Chapter 524. At this moment, not only could Li Yunxin not perceive the details, but he could not even perceive the subtle sensations in his body. His body gradually became numb, like the numbness brought about by overfilling his blood. Boundless power filled every crevice in his body, trying to find an outlet to vent it out. Previously he had raised his fist and punched the wall. It was a subconscious action in a moment of desperation. In fact, a more rational approach would have been to check the magic treasure in his little finger, find a suitable item and escape. But it seemed that this subconscious action, purely to vent his anger, had saved his life. Power filled his body so quickly that it soon approached the critical point. His body had not been tempered again, so it was unlikely that it could withstand such a majestic spiritual power. But with every punch, some of the spiritual power in his body poured out. It was as if he was a bucket full of water, which was still pouring in. But if he could scoop some out bit by bit, the moment when he exploded would come later. But in the end, that moment still had to come. Only a dozen breaths had passed since Grandpa D left. Li Yunxin's muscles, bones, skin, and flesh had reached their limits and could no longer support it. Terrifying transformations began to take place. His face and limbs began to distort. Even the space around him began to distort. Many colors and sceneries appeared and withered like epiphyllum, but they were also distorted and hideous. But another change also appeared at this moment. He felt that in his perception, or maybe it was just an illusion, the whole world flickered for a moment. He always had a sense of alienation from this world. This sense of alienation might be because of his special background, or because of his special constitution. He had experienced many things, but he always felt that he was a bystander. As a stranger in a foreign land, he could not be familiar with some people and things. But at this moment he seemed to be embedded with this world. A black light suddenly flashed in his divine sense. Previously, when Grandpa D injected the black seed into his body, the cold flame flowed against the meridians, allowing him to see his gray seed for a moment. At this moment he saw it again. But this time it was clearer. The gray void once again appeared in the range of his divine sense. It seemed that because of the abundant spiritual power in his body, the details in this void were clearer. At this moment, Li Yunxin was examining it with his divine sense, so there wasn't much of a problem of looking carefully, or paying attention. What he saw was what he thought. There was nothing that he could overlook. Now that it was clear, more details could be seen. The black humanoid figure in the center had his own face. This was to be expected and there was nothing surprising about it. However, the black figure's movements were a little strange. His hands and feet were tightly wrapped around his torso, as if he had been tied up. However, his expression was very solemn. The gray void around the figure made Li Yunxin shocked and stunned. There was an image in the gray void. Although it was only a silhouette, it was clear that it was a mountain. There seemed to be a courtyard on the mountain peak and there were a few houses in the courtyard. Be it the mountain peak or the courtyard, they were all very familiar. It was his temporary imperial residence. Li Yunxin had always thought that the temporary imperial residence of a demon was strange. They appeared too abruptly and seemed out of place in this world. Although the magical powers in the world were magical, there was still a clear cultivation system. However, there was no other explanation for the temporary imperial residence other than the saying, when a demon's cultivation reaches a certain level, he can create a temporary imperial residence. But now, could it be related to this demon's demon seed? Thinking quickly, he realized that this speculation was not without reason. There were two things that seemed to be unique to demons: the demon seed and the temporary imperial residence. Now he saw the image of the mountain peak and the courtyard in his temporary imperial residence on the gray seed that Gong Di mentioned. Could it be that these two things were just different manifestations of the same thing? However, he remembered something else. Su Weng had sneaked into his temporary imperial residence and refined Lu Ling's 6 desires tribulation body inside. Previously, Li Yunxin was deeply afraid of him because of this. He could actually sneak into someone else's temporary imperial residence. Previously he was puzzled and did not know how he did it. But now that he knew that the temporary imperial residence was related to the demon seed, could it be that there was something mysterious about it? His physical body was now on the verge of collapse, but his thoughts were running much faster than usual. After thinking about so many things in a split second, the change had just begun. The black figure that looked like him suddenly trembled and suddenly swelled up. It was very similar to what he looked like now. His body was filled with spiritual power and swelled up. When the black figure swelled up, the pressure on his physical body suddenly decreased. It was as if there was a decompression valve at the bottom of the bucket, and now it was finally opened. The surging power found a new outlet. It poured into the black figure in his divine sense like an avalanche. This figure was like a bottomless pit. The spiritual power that almost made Li Yunxin explode only made him swell up. Then it stopped changing, but the face became clearer and fuller. After a while, the black seed that Grandmaster D put into his body also gathered. Cold flames wrapped around the body of this small black figure, as if putting on a black armor for him. Everything happened very quickly. Li Yunxin's divine sense seemed to have witnessed the whole process, but he also felt that it happened in the blink of an eye. He really wanted to see this small figure clearly, and he really wanted to understand what the void and the small figure represented. These two things were tangible. Tangible meant that it was not the origin. Therefore he moved his divine sense closer, wanting to take a closer look. However, once he did so, the black figure seemed to have an attraction force. It sucked his divine sense into its body just like how it absorbed the spiritual power. Intelligence was not something that had a material form. When a person's consciousness or attention was attracted to a certain place, there was no difference between there or not there. Therefore at this moment, Li Yunxin's gaze stayed in the body of this small figure for a short while, and he saw another strange scene. In fact, the body of this small figure, which looked like him, was more like a human-shaped window than a person. And he looked through this window. What he saw was a brilliant sea of stars. The silver sea was brilliant and there were countless bright stars. However, the sea of stars that Li Yunxin saw was a ghastly sight. Enormous clusters of light were blossoming all over the sky, spreading out in all directions. It was as if countless stars had exploded, leaving only such a magnificent but poignant scene. This vast void and destruction made his heart palpitate. A feeling of insignificance and loneliness grew and spread in a corner, like a huge hand suddenly grabbing his heart. Although he had experienced these two feelings more deeply than most people, Li Yunxin suddenly felt terrified and helpless. He was so frightened that he almost broke out in a sweat. Because of this shock, his divine sense suddenly retreated. He found that he had fallen to the ground. He was still in the narrow room. But the wall in front of him had a gap that was as wide as a person's width. He did not know how many punches he had unconsciously punched when he was temporarily absent-minded. The cocoon was still spinning. But the light that it emitted was becoming calmer. This stable and bright white light was similar to the sunlight that he saw on the floating mountain. Since this thing was driving the cloud mountain, perhaps, the heavenly light he saw was indeed emitted by this thing. Although the light had become calmer, the spiritual power contained in it was still strong. But at this moment, when Li Yunxin bathed in this spiritual power, he only felt that his body was full and his spirit was harmonious. He did not feel full at all. Inside his body, the small figure that was surrounded by cold flames was absorbing all the spiritual power that he could not absorb. Not only did it save his life, but it also allowed him to adjust his breath in this extremely rich spiritual power. Before he came here, he was still in the advanced realm of Jinren, and the demonic power in his body was almost full. But now he was in the perfect realm of Jinren. No, he was at the peak of the realm of truth, and his demonic power was also at the peak of the realm of truth. The black seed that Grandmaster D had inserted into his body had raised his realm. The elder of the Freemasonry had originally looked up to him. But later on, because of one sentence or a few sentences that went wrong, his attitude suddenly became cold. More importantly, he had left him alone in this narrow room to wait for death. If there was only the gray seed in Li Yunxin's body and not another strange human form that he did not know about, he would have exploded from the terrible power. Now, this cultivation paradise was going to become his burial ground. When he first met Grandmaster D, he did not have a bad impression of him. His way of talking was also neutral and peaceful, and he seemed to be different from those wandering souls and cultivators. But he did not expect that he would change his attitude faster than turning the page of a book. In the blink of an eye, he had fallen into a dangerous situation. From this, it could be seen that those who were related to the Freemasonry were probably not good people. Li Yunxin adjusted his breath for a while and then stood up. This was indeed a good place. If he cultivated here, he would probably advance by leaps and bounds. However, since the elder of the Freemasonry had appeared on the floating mountain, it meant that he could not stay here for long. Originally, he wanted to find a way to destroy this core and destroy the lair of the Taoist sect of wonders. But now, he knew that this so-called core in Cloud Mountain seemed to be equally important and guarded something. Although he did not completely believe this, it was not good to gamble on something of this level. Thus, he decided to get out of this narrow room and take a look at the situation outside before deciding whether to continue ambushing the two wandering souls, or to leave quickly. The hole in the wall of the narrow room that he had blasted was like a flash of lightning, or the side of a person's face. There was a faint white light on the wall, but it was pitch black in the gap and he could not see the way out. He hesitated for a while but finally took a deep breath and jumped into the gap. It was dark in front of him, but then it lit up. The world suddenly reversed. When he jumped in, it was a horizontal jump, but in an instant it became a fall. In front of him was a ground covered with broken bricks and tiles. He hurriedly exerted some strength in his legs and stood firm. This place was still the floating mountain. It should be the original Qi Hall. But the entire Qi Hall was gone, along with a large number of buildings nearby. Before he and Grandpa D entered the narrow room, the black spots were falling and eroding most of the roof of the Qi Hall. The destruction might have continued after that, but the black rain that had disappeared now, should not have caused such destruction. It was as if a giant had ruthlessly slashed down from the top of Little Cloud Mountain. The Qi Hall, along with the halls to the east and west, were all destroyed and razed to the ground. This slash mark was very long. At least, from where Li Yunxin stood, he could not see the end of it. What did this? He had spent a few nights on Little Cloud Mountain, and knew that although there was no moon on Little Cloud Mountain, there was a very beautiful watery moonlight. But he did not know if it was an illusion, but the moonlight tonight was a little dimmer than usual. Li Yunxin subconsciously looked up at the top of the sky and was stunned. On the top of Little Cloud Mountain there was a huge crack. The huge crack was in the shape of lightning and also looked like the side of a person's face. It traversed half of the sky. And this crack on the ground, which came from the Qi Hall, seemed to be one with the crack on the top of the sky. Something had slashed in this direction. Originally, it had slashed on the side walls of Little Cloud Mountain, but the floating mountain was in the middle of Little Cloud Mountain, blocking it. Li Yunxin opened his mouth and his mind was completely sluggish, although it was only for a moment. The crack on the top of the sky, why did it look so familiar? A few breaths ago he had seen it with his own eyes. It was the crack that he had blasted on the wall of that narrow room. Could it be because of the formation, that the damage he had caused in the room had been projected onto this Little Cloud Mountain? Once this thought appeared in his mind, many details immediately surged into his mind like waves. At that time he had been in the same narrow room with Grandmaster D. Because of Grandmaster D's abnormal behavior, he had almost focused all his attention on Grandmaster D. Therefore, although he had noticed some details in that room, he did not take them to heart. Now that he thought about it, he felt that there were many things that he had a vague impression of, but he could not be sure. Even so, a very bold idea appeared in Li Yunxin's mind. He had to confirm this idea. Without hesitation, he turned around and ran towards the entrance of the narrow room from which Grandmaster D had entered. There was originally an iron platform there. Only after Grandmaster D had smashed open the iron platform did the entrance appear. Now the iron platform had been completely flattened and had become a discus. But now Li Yunxin was at the peak of the true state and was full of demonic power. Among all the famous demons and cultivators in the world, there were not many who could defeat him in a head-on clash with their physical bodies. Therefore he used a little force and opened the thick and big iron cover. It did not take him much effort to find the entrance. It was still a narrow hole, which looked gloomy under the shadow of the iron cover. But when he took a deep breath and jumped down again, he stepped on solid ground. Grandmaster D jumped down and immediately entered the narrow room. Now he was completely at a wrong place. There was a common legend in the secular world about a person who mistakenly entered the immortal mountain and obtained a fated chance, but when he wanted to go again he could not enter. This feeling was actually experienced by him today. But he was already mentally prepared for this. If the entrance could really be found by flipping open the iron platform, it would have been discovered long ago. So he had to take a risky move. After hesitating for only 3 breaths, he shrank his body and simply sat in the hole. Then he pulled his hand and covered himself with the huge iron cover. Many details were indeed seen by one person. But at that time he did not pay attention, so he did not remember it. But this "did not remember" usually meant that he did not pay attention to it on the surface. The details were still in his mind, he was just waiting for a fated chance day when his subconscious was suddenly touched, and then the details would pop out. In the past he used hypnosis to make many people remember things that they did not know. Now he decided to use it on himself again. From the decision to the execution, it only took him 6 breaths. It was not easy to hypnotize oneself, especially for someone like him. However, with the help of 1 or 2 magic treasures that were especially good at illusions, he sat upright in the shadow and slowly exhaled for the 23rd time. Then he succeeded. The details reappeared. Although many of them were incomplete and blurred and distorted due to the influence of his subjective consciousness at that time, more of these details could still be compared from different angles, and he could still restore the scene he saw at that time. There was indeed something fishy about that wall. Chapter 525. There were fine lines on the wall. Faint and indistinct fine lines. The reason why Li Yunxin didn't notice them was because he thought that they were faint shadows formed by the reflection of light over a long period of time. At that time the wall was emitting white light. No matter how pure and flawless the material was, once a strong light shone from behind it, people would feel that there were many flickering spots on it when they looked at it. This was because of the structure of a person's eyes. And because of this impression, Li Yunxin subconsciously ignored those shadows. Now, those shadows and details once again emerged from his subconscious. They were all meaningful. Light and shadow began to combine. They were summarized and sorted out by his rational consciousness. He eliminated some useless details and misdirection, and strengthened some blurry impressions. Finally, the complete picture appeared in front of him. On the wall of the narrow room was a complete map. Those shadows seemed to be carved on the wall outside the narrow room, and when the light shone in from the outside, the shadows produced by those patterns appeared on the inner wall. It was somewhat similar to drawing the pattern on the outside of an empty eggshell and then shining a strong light in. Normally, it would be very difficult to distinguish what exactly these patterns were. Even Li Yunxin couldn't do it. But coincidentally, he had seen the imperial map of the sky and imperial map before. With the terrain of the Central Plains 36 countries in the imperial map of the sky and imperial map as a reference, he finally matched the map in this narrow room. After carefully distinguishing it, he knew that the rest of the places were actually topographic maps. But the topographic map here was different. It should actually be called a spiritual map. Mountains, rivers, plains, and valleys. These different terrains would affect the distribution of spiritual energy. If spiritual energy was like a thin mist that was originally spread flat on the ground, then the rise of mountains and the fall of valleys would also have a significant impact on the density of spiritual energy. The reason why the pattern on this map was blurry and like a shadow was because it drew the distribution of spiritual energy instead of mountains and rivers. A mountain range stretched for thousands of miles, perhaps dozens of miles wide. The influence of such a mountain range on the distribution of spiritual energy in the surroundings would be much greater than that of the mountain itself. It might extend to thousands or even tens of thousands of kilometers. Thus, if the topography of the mountain range was a line on the map, then the impact of this line would be a surface. If Li Yunxin had not seen the Huangyu Heavenly Sutra, nor was he a person with great cultivation and keen observation skills, it would be impossible for him to understand what exactly the picture formed by these shadows was. However, he had previously obtained the Huangyu Heavenly Diagram, and because he wanted to unlock the secret of the formation that sealed the Golden Rock King, he had spent a lot of effort to figure out the crypts that were distributed among the countries and the distribution of spiritual power near the crypts. Now that he saw this thing again, many places matched with his previous analysis and observations. How could he not know what it was? As the saying goes, fortune and misfortune come hand in hand. Previously he was trapped here by Grandpa D and almost died. However, he saw such a treasure. And the reason why it was considered a treasure was because, previously he wanted to figure out what the various crypts on the Huangyu Heavenly Sutra corresponded to. And to figure this out, he had to first figure out the circulation of qi and the distribution of spiritual power around them. However, in reality the mountains and rivers near the crypts crisscrossed, and they were closely related to the influence of people. It would take more than one person and a day to figure it out. Therefore, Li Yunxin had given up this idea and realized that the key to unlocking the secret of the Huangyu Heavenly Sutra should be in the translucent jade slip. Therefore, he planned to take back the jade slip. Unexpectedly, in that narrow room, someone had already marked out the distribution of spiritual power on the map. Perhaps he could use a long time to recall these contents in his subconscious. However, now that he had fallen into his own consciousness and was on this floating mountain, there was no one around to protect him. Doing such a dangerous thing in an environment full of dangers, he couldn't stay for too long. Thus, after a few breaths of time, he opened his eyes in the darkness, a little dazed. He spent a long time in a daze thinking hard about something. Then he slowly spat out some unknown scales and words in a vague and low voice. Finally, his speech became clearer and his eyes became clearer. About a quarter of an hour later, he took a deep breath as if he was convulsing and completely woke up. He took the risk to travel through the world of his consciousness. In fact, it was possible that he would never wake up. But this time he succeeded. It was half a success. After waking up, he forgot most of what he had just seen, but he still retained some key things. At least now, he knew roughly what the Guanyuan crypt, where hatred's lair was located, and what the circulation of spiritual power around it looked like. And he also knew part of the secret of this little cloud mountain. This so-called little cloud mountain was actually a miniature world of reality. It was impossible for people who saw Little Cloud Mountain for the first time to come to this conclusion. There was a vast forest on the ground of Little Cloud Mountain, and there was a winding river in between. This kind of layout, no matter what, could not be related to a world. Which world would only have one river? But the reason why Li Yunxing could see through this secret was because of 2 points. After he escaped from the narrow room, he saw the crack. That crack was the faithful reaction and projection of the one he left on the narrow room's wall. On the wall of the narrow room, what was drawn was the layout of spiritual power in the vast real world, which also meant that there was a similar layout in Little Cloud Mountain. In other words, that narrow room seemed to be something that could control this Little Cloud Mountain. For example, he once drew the 100 miles of rivers and mountains painting near the city of Wei. If his magical power was great enough and his realm high enough, he could theoretically use this painting to affect reality. Of course, that was just a theory he deduced based on his understanding of painting. But today he really encountered such a thing. If this thing was real, how did it come about? This thought once ran to the art Saint Qinzhao. After all, the principle behind this was different from painting. But he quickly denied himself. Cloud Mountain appeared 50,000 years ago. Long before the art saint appeared in this world, these things had already existed. If he didn't think about these questions for the time being, the crack in the narrow room was faithfully projected into this Little Cloud Mountain. Then the thing in Little Cloud Mountain, would it also be projected into the real world? This thought made Li Yunxing slowly exhale a breath of cold air. If it was real, it meant that there was a huge crack that was almost 1/3 the length of the whole world and as wide as a country outside Cloud Mountain. This thought shocked him. But he quickly denied it. Because he still remembered that when he first came to Little Cloud Mountain, he jumped straight down from the cliff. Such a huge force not only destroyed a few trees, but also blasted a deep hole in the ground. If the changes that happened on Little Cloud Mountain were also faithfully reflected in the real world, then the crater that he had created at that time would probably be the size of the Yu Kingdom. Moreover, he and Su Sheng had destroyed so many pavilions along the way. If such a thing really happened, Su Sheng would definitely stop him. When Li Yunxing thought of this, he actually felt a headache coming on. He had long thought that there would be many secrets on Cloud Mountain, but he didn't think that there would be so many unimaginable secrets. People said that the immortals created Cloud Mountain and left behind an array to drive Cloud Mountain to move on the earth to protect the human world. But now, how could it be so easy? The connection between the narrow room and Little Cloud Mountain must mean something. Those so-called gray and black seeds should also be related to these things. There were many magical powers in this world, spiritual power, demonic power, and all kinds of cultivation methods. In the past, Li Yunxing thought that these things were profound theories in this world that could deeply explain the nature and laws of the world. But now that he had walked around Cloud Mountain, he realized the Tao and theories that he, as well as those cultivators and demons knew, were just fleeting shadows. They only knew what they were but didn't know why. The true essence, the inside story, was related to the mysterious connection between the narrow room and Little Cloud Mountain. It was related to the gray seeds and black seeds. It was related to the sea of lava that he had seen before, the Black Yama King on the spear. He only knew a little about this world, he only knew a little about it. The only thing he could do now was to temporarily store these thoughts. Then he raised his hand to lift the iron cover above his head and jumped out of the hole. The Qi Hall was already at the edge of the floating mountain. He could see the forest below the floating mountain if he walked quickly for a while. He had stayed in the forest for a few days and had a battle of wits with Xan Shilio. During that time he had naturally tried to set up arrays while walking. But because his spiritual power was restricted, he couldn't form an array. But because of this, he had long discovered that there were some differences in the forest. For example, in the forest, the spiritual power wasn't abundant everywhere, but there were different levels of it. This was very common in the real world. For example, the spiritual power near the city of Wei was abundant, but in the wild forest 100 miles away, it was thinner. And further south, in the June Mountain area, the spiritual power was abundant again. But the difference was in the scale. In the real world, the uneven distribution was measured in units of a few miles, dozens of miles, or hundreds of miles. But this little cloud mountain was only a few hundred miles wide. And it wasn't formed naturally but was man-made. But on such a small scale. Li Yunxin found that the spiritual power would change greatly every few steps or even a dozen steps. At that time he didn't think much about it. He just thought that maybe it was a paradise of Shenmen. Strangeness had its own reasons. But now, after seeing the scene in the narrow room and having the experience of looking at the distribution of spiritual power in the whole world from a broader and macroscopic perspective, the strangeness of the forest seemed to be explained. The position determined the field of vision. Now, with the limited memory that he stole from the narrow room, he stood on the floating mountain top and had a bird's-eye view of the places he had been to before. He outlined the few points where the spiritual power was different along the way, and then tried to overlap it with the distribution of spiritual power in the narrow room in his mind. Finally, he realized, the little cloud mountain was indeed an enlarged version of the narrow room. The direction of the spiritual power on the walls of the narrow room was faithfully reflected in the little cloud mountain. Every 3 or 4 steps, there would be a difference in the density of the spiritual power. These 3 or 4 steps, in the real world under the little cloud mountain, would be hundreds of thousands of miles. What it showed was the difference in the spiritual power in the real world. This little cloud mountain was actually a miniature version of the real world. It was like a 3D landscape map of 1,000 miles, 10,000 miles, or even 1,000,000 miles. He didn't know who created such a great and terrifying thing. And they even covered it with a vast forest and created a river. They changed and covered the landscape that was almost the same as the real world. They also used even more ingenious methods to make the camouflage so that the spiritual power would not change. When Li Yunxin first saw painting Saint Chen Tao's spirit map in Evil King's Pitfall Mountain, he was shocked by the incredibly complicated aura in the picture. Even if he exhausted his imagination, he couldn't imagine that someone could create such a picture using any method he knew. Therefore, at that time, he put away the contempt in his heart and realized that there were indeed many things in this world that he couldn't understand or even do. But now, the shock that this thing brought him was more than 100 times greater than before. If painting Saint Chen Tao was alive and saw these things, it should be the same feeling he had when he saw the Holy Spirit map in Pitfall Mountain, right? But now that he had discovered this secret, Li Yunxin stood at the edge of the cliff of the floating mountain. Under the moonlight, with his back against the huge scar in the sky, he let out a long sigh. He knew that his unlucky days, although he didn't know what would happen in the future at least for this period of time, were coming to an end. People always have a change of luck. Looks like I'll be rich one day. He grinned, took a step forward and jumped down. Chapter 526. There was no sun or moon in the mountains. The sun and moon in the clouds were even more difficult to distinguish. After Li Yunxin snuck into Cloudy Mountain, the battle outside did not stop. It didn't stop and became even more intense. The moment the 2 wandering souls who called themselves the 2 sages came out of the mountain, they were seen through. Most high-level cultivators were different from mortals, but they were not bound by honor or emotions. As a result, internal strife broke out in the Shenmen camp on the spot. The demons took advantage of the situation to pursue and attack, pushing all the way to less than 100 miles below the Cloud Mountain. After that, the fake Holy Ghost summoned the wandering souls that were originally stationed in various places back to help. Only then did the decline stop. After that, the 2 sides advanced and retreated, and the battlefront finally stabilized 200 li away from the Cloud Mountain. The descent of the Cloud Mountain was an extremely slow process. But after 8 hours he finally sat steadily in the Tongtian swamp. However, the demons, who never seemed to know what fatigue was, once again launched a fierce attack, pointing their weapons at Mount Yun. It was as if they had seen the decline of the celestial sect and wanted to take them down in one go. Seriously, reckless. Standing on the high platform, Su Yusong snorted in a low voice. He and Zhuamuxia were supposed to return to Little Cloud Mountain and deal with the nobles and dukes brought back by the wandering souls. However, before they left, they received a message from Grandmaster D. He ordered them to never return to Mount Yunshan unless they defeated the demons. This order was resolute and fierce, and the tone was unkind. When the two wandering souls received the order, they heaved a sigh of relief at the same time. This meant that the elders hiding in Cloud Mountain were about to make a move. When the two of them first came out of Cloud Mountain, they only wore the skin of a sage and not their physical bodies. It was because they were afraid that the power would be too strong for them to control. If they looked stupid and stumbling, they would be seen through at a glance. That was why the Profound Realm sect masters and sect masters had put them in such a difficult situation, and the defensive line had been quickly routed. Grandmaster D asked them to go down the mountain, saying that it was to find the Red Pearl. With such a defeat, there was no need to talk about finding the Red Pearl. Therefore, he had planned to return to the Little Cloud Mountain and wear the sage's body. But in reality, this was also a stupid idea. Cloud Mountain Xian Sect Ancestral Court. It was driven by a celestial's formation, and there was a powerful barrier around it. How could such a thing only be able to defend and not attack? Su Yusong and Zhuamuxia knew that the formation on Cloud Mountain could help them. This was because he had read about something in the ancient books of the Celestial Sect of Wonders. It was said that in a certain year, during the reign of a certain saint, Yunshan had fallen to the ground. In the end, it happened to be that year when the land moved. The commotion was so great that dozens of nearby counties and prefectures could feel it. It even caused rivers to change their course and mountains to collapse. Anyone who had experienced the power of an earthquake would know how powerful it was. Because it was so powerful, it seemed to have triggered a certain mechanism in the Cloud Mountain. It was said that at that time, the entire cloudy mountain suddenly emitted thousands of beams of mysterious light. Although they disappeared in the blink of an eye, the land nearby was boiled, and the boiling magma was hundreds of feet deep. The word used in the records was an instant. One had to know that the reaction of mortals was slow, but the reaction of cultivators was extremely sensitive. In the instant of the saint's perception, such a powerful force poured out in all directions. How powerful was the formation, how terrifying was its power. At that time, the saint discovered this and knew that there was a powerful force hidden in Yunshan that they did not know about. It seemed that the earthquake had triggered that force, thinking that Yunshan was in trouble, so it was triggered. However, after searching hard, there was no result, and they realized that the force might have something to do with the formation of the Celestials in the mountain. It should be an insurance that the Celestials had left for Yunshan. If they encountered a calamity in the future and were at their wits' end, there was still such a backup plan. The saints could not find a clue, but the elders of the Freemasonry seemed to be able to. The reason why Su Yusong thought so was because he felt that he had understood the temperament of the elders. Those people all looked to be in the Grand Supreme Realm, but for some reason they seemed to be unable to use their divine powers or physical bodies. Logically speaking, the physical bodies of the Grand Supreme Realm were enough to run amok in the world, but they seemed to think that their bodies were the most precious in the world, and they could not touch even the slightest bit of danger. Yet, such a group of people chose to hide in Yunshan. Yunshan was high in the sky and was indeed safe. However, there were many cultivators in Yunshan. Once the secret of the Freemasonry was exposed and the hiding place of the elders was discovered, Yunshan would probably become the most dangerous place in the world for the elders. Therefore, they must have something that they thought was enough to protect themselves and intimidate cultivators. The reason why Su Yusong and Zhuamuxia were trapped for more than 1,000 years and did not use their divine powers to force their way out of Yunshan was because they were afraid of this matter. Now that the demons were besieging them, the elders gave a slightly arrogant order of, if they could not defeat the demons, they were not allowed to return to Yunshan. It seemed to mean that they had nothing to fear. They had a trump card in their hands and knew that this matter could be resolved in the end, but they insisted on asking the wandering souls of the Freemasonry to fight to the death first. This was indeed what the elders would do. They wanted to destroy the demons and the celestial sect. How could they not want to destroy those who were becoming more and more disobedient to them and who were becoming more and more of a threat? Su Yusong's guess was right. Less than an hour after receiving the first order from Grandpa D, the second order arrived. It was to ask them to gather the demons in one place and then slowly make a plan. Previously, the demons had already defeated the cultivators of the celestial sect. If they were to get entangled with them, what was there to plan for? They would probably be pushed up Yunshan even faster. But since they gave such a stupid order at this moment, Su Yusong was certain that the elders and the demons had the same idea. They wanted to destroy. It was just that the big demons wanted to sacrifice the small demons to achieve their own realm. And the elders would not even let the big demons go. Therefore, when he saw the fiendish demons attacking again, Su Yusong stood on the 6 temporary high platforms and sneered. These demons weren't exactly stupid. The Dragon Sun's plan was quite clear. They knew that the celestial sect wanted to get rid of the demons, so they drove them to come forward and reap the benefits for themselves. However, when a smart person made some wrong decisions because he lacked some key information, he had already become a fool. For example, now, the demon army was attacking from 3 directions and was unstoppable. The cultivators of the celestial sect had been retreating and had lost their fighting spirit. But this place was different. It was under Yunshan. The masters who had cultivated to the profound realm might not have any emotions and could leave as they pleased. But the low-level cultivators still had attachment and respect for the celestial sect's ancestral court. These were beautiful emotions even for wandering souls like Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia. It was because of these beautiful emotions that the low-level cultivators gathered their courage and continued the battle to defend Yunshan. They actually delayed the demons' attack. Now, the demons from 3 directions were besieging the cultivators in front. Originally, both sides could fly in the sky and dig into the ground, and the battle line was extremely long. But now, people were gathered in front of the Yunshan array and subconsciously shrank together to protect themselves. There were more demons than cultivators to begin with. At this time, they were far superior to the latter. If one looked down from the sky, they would realize that the cultivators had gathered into a strong array with a radius of several kilometers. The demons surrounded them from 3 sides and were nibbling away at their power like silk from a cocoon. However, once the cultivators gathered together, they knew how to cooperate better than the demons and did not collapse for a while. But it was only a matter of time. On the platform, Su Yusong first sighed at the foolishness of the demons. After a pause, he sighed again. Sigh. It's a good situation. Others might not know, but Zhuomuxia, who was beside him, knew. The good situation he mentioned referred to the hearts of those cultivators. Such strength, such emotions. They could have been used by them, as long as they waited for another 1,000 years and waited patiently for the other high-level cultivators to either die of old age or become one of them. But now, such people and hearts were going to be buried here in vain. Su Yusong sighed and could not help but turn his head to look at Yunshan. Zhuomuxia said in a low voice, "Let's watch." The two of them had been together for a long time and had long understood each other's intentions. With just a few words, they knew what the other party was talking about. For example, Zhuomuxia wanted Su Yusong to watch, but not to watch the battle. Instead, he looked at Yunshan. They wanted to see what kind of magical power the elders on Yunshan could use at such a desperate moment. They had been subservient to the authority of the elders for too long. And after such a long time, the fear brought about by the mystery had begun to fade. The more they knew about the elders, the more they felt that they were not unreachable. Today it was probably the last test. It was also at this time that a warning sign appeared. Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia's hearts jumped at the same time. It was as if there was a string that had always been taut. When it was there, you had been used to it and could not notice it. But now that the string had suddenly broken, a warning sign suddenly appeared in their hearts. Someone had forcibly passed through the restriction of Yunshan. The expressions of the 2 wandering souls changed at the same time. Who was it at this time? It was impossible to pass through the restriction of Yunshan with brute force unless one had the cultivation of the supreme realm. But looking at the world now, the master of calligraphy had become a tribulation body and had no magical power. The master of sword had never shown up, but he was definitely stronger than the master of calligraphy. As for the rest, just as they thought of this, the talisman in their sleeves buzzed and vibrated again. This talisman had always been used with the elders. Without hesitation, Su Yusong reached into his sleeve and took it out. He saw the 3rd order. He handed it to Zhuomuxia after reading it. The expression on his face eased a little, but he frowned. Grandmaster D said he was the one who made the array. Tell us to gather a few more demons. He may have to use his tricks. Zhuomuxia's expression also changed. He left Yunshan? He came out. Ever since they gained consciousness, they had never seen an elder leave the floating mountain peak, much less leave Cloud Mountain. And at this time, Li Yunxin was in the palace of Qi regretting and flying into a rage. He had given the translucent jade slip to the 2 wandering souls. Then he began to set up a trap for the fake sage, thinking that the 2 people might come back to check if they knew that the restriction of Yunshan had been triggered. But they would never know that it was the elders of the Freemasonry who told the 2 wandering souls not to come back. All these things happened at the same time. And after about half an hour, Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia still did not know what was happening on the floating mountain. At this time, there were many casualties among the Taoist sect cultivators. The two of them also became anxious. The wandering souls were behind them, not on the battlefield. If the elders of Yunshan delayed and did not use their tricks, this group of people would definitely collapse. At that time he would have to call the possessed sect masters and sect leaders to come forward. But these people, they were an indispensable part of his plan for the future. The Taoist sect was destroyed, but the two wandering souls wanted to completely take over the remaining power of the Taoist sect for their own use. These people would be the foundation for him to rebuild the Taoist sect. If the elders wanted him to throw these people into the battlefield as well, at this moment Su Yusong's mind was spinning. He used to think that he was more scheming than others, and that many people and things in the world were under his control. For example, Li Yunxin thought that his intelligence was unparalleled in the world, but in the end, didn't he still fall into his own trap and die on the battlefield? One had to know that he was in the Little Cloud Mountain. Although the time in the Little Cloud Mountain could not be adjusted as he pleased due to certain restrictions, it was still possible to treat one day as several days and several days as one day when needed. Thus, a matter that others needed to make a decision in an instant could be extended by several times for him to think carefully and deduce. One plan might not be perfect, but he still had enough time to consider a few more plans. In terms of strategy, anyone in the world who competed with him was practically equivalent to competing with a dozen or even dozens of him. In the past he had enough time to check and fill in the gaps. However, now that he had left the Cloud Mountain, he was facing the ever-changing battlefield. Many orders and decisions had to be issued in an instant. More thoughts flowed through his mind, requiring him to integrate a large amount of information in an extremely short period of time. Yet every time this happened, his thoughts couldn't help but wander. Many details related to one matter rushed into his mind at the same time, making it difficult for him to grasp the main point. On the Cloud Mountain, this was his advantage. He would have enough time to investigate every detail. In the end, he would integrate everything and arrive at a conclusion that was extremely close to the truth. But it was precisely because of this advantage that his thoughts became scattered and slow, at least in this real world. Thus, his previous advantage had now become a disadvantage. After leaving the Little Cloud Mountain, he made a series of wrong decisions. Because of this, he could not adapt to the ever-changing situation. He tried to consider every factor, but there was no time for him to do so. In the end, he could only rely on luck to arrive at a certain conclusion and make a certain decision. Thus, in the eyes of others, he appeared extremely careless and stupid. On the Little Cloud Mountain, Li Yunxin had said that he did not have the bearing of a true saint, and that his thoughts were constantly changing. It seemed to be because of this reason. And at this time, Su Yusong once again thought of Li Yunxin's words. In the past, he used to regard these words as the mockery of a defeated opponent. But now, he gradually realized that what that guy said seemed to be reasonable. For example, what he was hesitating about now was, for some reason, the elders of the Freemasonry might have left the Little Cloud Mountain. They said they were going to use their divine ability but never did so. The cultivators at the front were about to be defeated. Should he call the people behind him to rush to the front? He wanted to preserve some of the power of the Mystic Gate. But he didn't want to completely break off relations with the elders. Now he wanted to call the remaining cultivators back, but he hoped that the blow from the Cloud Mountain would arrive in the next moment. What if the blow was so strong that he couldn't muster the confidence to fight back, and finally realized that the elders were indeed powerful and couldn't be disobeyed? What should he do? Su Yusong groaned in his heart. He didn't kill Li Yunxin, it would be great. He really subdued him before. He was good at scheming and Li Yunxin was good at scheming. He wouldn't have fallen into such an awkward situation, right? But Su Yusong's distraught state didn't last long. Very soon, a strange phenomenon appeared. The battle lasted for several hours. It was already evening and the sky was gradually darkening. At this time, fire rain began to fall from the sky. Chapter 527. At first no one noticed it. This was because before the fiery rain in the sky became fiery rain, it was more like ashes. This was a battlefield. Both fiendish demons and cultivators could create extremely high temperatures and violent airwaves. Therefore, the situation on the battlefield looked even more fiery than the war in Li Yunxin's era. Blazing flames could be seen everywhere, engulfing everything that could be burned, turning it into ashes, and sweeping it up into the sky with a scorching air current. When these ashes reached the sky, They would create even more violent air currents when great demons and high-level cultivators fought. Therefore they would be shot down again. They entangled in the sky and finally gathered together, turning into white, gray or black embers. Then like a sky full of snow they fell to the ground. Therefore although it was late autumn, the battlefield was like midwinter, with black and white goose feather snow falling. In reality the scene on the battlefield was even stranger. The effects of various divine abilities were mixed together, forming strange changes that even the spellcasters themselves had not expected. As a result, all kinds of strange phenomena were triggered in the land within a radius of dozens of kilometers. For example, in this place because of the extremely cold palm force, snow was floating. Hundreds of steps away because of a great demon's divine ability, it was so dry that the skin was about to crack. But further up, it was a heavy downpour that turned into superheated steam in midair. Therefore when those black spots appeared in midair no one noticed them. But after a while the black spots burned. It wasn't the black spots themselves that were burning. It was more like they had some kind of mysterious reaction with the extremely heterogeneous spiritual power in this space, causing the spiritual power that enveloped them to burn. Therefore the fiery rain suddenly appeared on the battlefield, above the heads of many fiendish demons and cultivators. The first fiendish demon who discovered these things did not care. But the change from not caring to horrified only took about a dozen breaths. During this period of time, anyone who came into contact with this rain of fire, regardless of whether they were demons, cultivators, intent realm or profound realm, righteous or evil, would immediately disappear without a trace. They only had enough time, or perhaps not even enough time, to leave behind an abruptly stopped scream. Hundreds of thousands of demons fought against tens of thousands of cultivators. They fought endlessly for many days, but only a few 100,000 casualties were caused. But in that instant, from the moment Su Yusong saw the rain of fire to the moment he, Zhuamuja, and the Freemason cultivators behind them retreated from the high platform in a panic, they had lost more than 50,000 demons and cultivators in about 15 minutes. It was an easy, indiscriminate killing. There had never been such a thing in this world, a thing that could ignore all spiritual power and a tyrannical body. In front of them, there was no difference between a profound domain and a profound realm, and neither was there any difference between flesh and metal. It was as if a banquet had been interrupted when it was in the middle of a hearty banquet. The massacre carefully planned by the demons and the wandering spirits of the Freemasons was also interrupted by an even more terrifying massacre. However, this rapid and concentrated rain of fire did not last for long. After a quarter of an hour they suddenly disappeared. It was as if he had accidentally jumped into the void and was a water stain that came from a terrible place. But now, after wreaking havoc and killing almost everyone on the battlefield, it suddenly evaporated. But it had already caused terrible consequences. If a heavy rain suddenly poured down in the wilderness, no one would be able to avoid it. Now this rain of fire was the same. Originally, both sides were going to fight to the death, thinking that there might be a turning point in the battle. However, in just a quarter of an hour, the hundreds of thousands of demons and cultivators on the ground and in the sky within a radius of several miles were killed. Before this, the battlefield was full of chaos. Every step they took they could step on mud like flesh and blood. But now the battlefield was empty. The remaining survivors stood blankly and in fear. They were the only ones within a few hundred steps. And the cultivators and demons who were crowding around him not long ago were all gone. This is... Su Yusong opened his mouth, but the words were stuck in his throat. Grandmaster D said, he did not know if this was the method that Grandmaster D said could help them exterminate the demons. If it was, there was a strange mass in front of him. 3 breaths ago this thing belonged to a great demon in the true realm. That great demon was extremely fierce and charged forward. It was about to kill through the cultivator's line of defense. When the black rain fell, it was centered on the entire cloud mountain, and the further it went, the thinner it became. But there was no rain at all near the inner part of the cloud mountain, as if the cloud mountain had blocked the black rain and cast a shadow. Therefore this demon saw that the situation was not good, and broke through the encirclement towards Su Yusong and the others. And he seemed to think that this was caused by the high-level Taoists of Xianmen, especially Su Yusong and the others. The great fear stimulated his courage, so this great demon almost rushed in front of Su Yusong 3 breaths ago. But at that moment, his body was stained by a drop of rain of fire. At that time, the rain of fire had slowly faded, but its power was not reduced. The terrifying great fiendish demon's body instantly contorted. It was as if the armor on his body, the golden hammer in his hand, the hair all over his body, and the muscles that were harder than metal were originally made of water. Now that the water was stirred, it immediately became a mess. Half of his body was sucked in, and then, the rain of fire suddenly disappeared. So the remaining half of his body fell down with a plop, right in front of Su Yusong. If he died just like that, there was nothing shocking about it. How many lives had they taken by their hands? What was really shocking was that he did not die immediately. Armor, weapons, hair, and flesh all merged into one, turning into a small oval. His muscles were exposed, but there was hair in it. The muscle fibers and hair were mixed together, as if they had been carefully torn apart by some power, and then rearranged strand by strand. His skin and armor were also mixed together, as if the armor had originally grown on his skin, and there were some small bones in between, and they were connected by fascia. His lungs were exposed and they were gasping for breath. And there was an eye embedded in the lungs which was spinning. This incomplete strange thing that seemed to have been maliciously crushed and reassembled by the gods stared fiercely at Su Yusong, and from his lungs came a purring sound. This scene shocked the two wandering souls and the people behind them. They did not know what kind of magic could turn a fierce great demon of the true state into this in an instant. For people like them who understood almost all the mysteries of this world, the unknown was not the most terrifying thing. Is this the trick of the elders? Is this the trick of the elders? Su Yusong nervously repeated these two sentences and turned to look at Zhuomuxia. No wonder they dared to call Yunshan down and dared to call the two of us out. Originally he still had the thought of independence. He thought that if the situation reached the worst, he might be able to gather the remaining forces of the celestial sect, and become another force that could compete with the elders. But now that he saw such a trick, he immediately remembered the records he had seen in the ancient books. The cloud mountain shot out thousands of beams of mystic light, creating a sea of lava around it. How could such a technique be inferior to what was recorded in the ancient records? If those seemingly cowardly elders had this kind of power, no wonder they could abandon the forces of the celestial sect. But Zhuomuxia did not answer him. Instead, he stared at the still alive piece of meat for a while, and then said in a low voice, "So that's what it means." After sighing, he took a step forward and pressed his palms slightly. Then, the piece of meat was immediately flattened by an invisible force, and burst open on the ground. There seemed to be a sigh of relief squeezed out of the lungs. Su Yusong looked at her strangely. At this moment, Zhuomuxia showed a calmness that was different from him. Although they were the two sages before, in this world the man was in charge of the outside and the woman was in charge of the inside, it was the same for these two wandering souls who pretended to be fake sages. Most of the time, Su Yusong acted arbitrarily, while Zhuomuxia acted according to his plan, and did not often put forward different opinions. But now, Su Yusong turned pale with fright, while Zhuomuxia appeared indifferent. She even lifted her foot and took 2 more steps forward, raising her hand to brush her eyes. Then she narrowed her eyes and looked into the distance, saying in a low voice, "That's not all." At this moment, there were not many survivors left on the battlefield. There were still less than 1,000 celestial sect cultivators left, and only tens of thousands of demons. It was just that these tens of thousands of demons were low-level demon soldiers and demon generals, and they were not very quick-witted. When they saw such a change, they were already scared out of their wits. Most of them immediately showed their true forms, ran wildly, burrowed underground, and flew far away. For a moment, there was chaos, and smoke and dust billowed, as if celestial sect had won a great battle. As for the remaining 1,000 cultivators, compared to the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands before, they were indeed not many. But if they were to gather in one place, it would be a sea of people that could not be seen at a glance. In the face of a great change, the meticulous and rational cultivators were always faster than the demons. Although this speed did not save most people from the fate of death, most of the survivors were high-level cultivators. A quarter of an hour ago, the celestial sect was defeated like a landslide. A quarter of an hour later, both sides were defeated. However, the surviving forces of each side had changed. Celestial sect had regained the absolute advantage. But it was impossible for these cultivators, almost all of them were above the transcendent state, to obey the orders of the two fake sages. In their hearts, this kind of terrible, indiscriminate killing, except for the two sages of the world, who else could do it? Thinking back to the internal strife among the high-grade cultivators in the camp, and seeing the fake Holy Emperor's group standing behind them, even the stupidest person would find it hard to believe, but they had no choice but to believe it. Su Yusong saw these people according to Zhuomuxia's words. His expression was slightly serious. "I know. It's a vicious plan to kill two birds with one stone. The elders did this and the rest of them also see us as enemies. It's impossible for us to gather our own forces. The only thing we can do is to follow them with all our hearts. But Wuxia shook her head gently. That's not what I'm talking about. She raised her hand again and pointed into the distance. Su Yusong was slightly stunned. But soon his expression changed and he also wiped his eyes. Then he saw it. In front of him was a vast plain. Usually this plain should be covered with withered yellow weeds, but it was previously occupied by cultivators and demons. Now there were only flesh and armor, wildfire and black smoke on the ground. Apart from the surviving cultivators, after Su Yusong opened his eye, he could also see the remnant souls. Long Sun started this war to plunder the remnant souls. But now, the wasteland was practically empty. Indeed, many cultivators and fiendish demons had died in the previous battle. However, after they died and were stunned for a moment, they either regained their sanity, or because their souls were too heavily damaged and their cultivation was too low, and they became wandering ghosts again. But in the end they would slowly leave the battlefield. On the battlefield, spiritual power was surging, and the killing intent was extremely strong. Even ghosts without consciousness would feel uncomfortable instinctively and stay far away. Therefore at this moment in the horizon that Su Yusong could see, there was indeed a group of green, dense wandering souls. Those were the souls of the dead from the previous slaughter. But on this battlefield where hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost in a quarter of an hour, but it was empty. The cultivators and demons who died, their remnant souls didn't stay. And they seemed to be absorbed by the rain of fire. Su Yusong opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. This attack had wiped out the cultivators and demons of the Taoist sect. It made the remaining survivors turn against them, and also put an end to the possibility of the two of them establishing their own sections. It also cut off the demons' thoughts of taking those remnant souls into their own pockets. Who had such a brilliant method? After another 3 breaths of time, Su Yusong suddenly frowned. Impossible, impossible. He glared at Wuxia. Do you believe it? Wuxia was silent for a while, then said in a low voice, We've been with the elders for so long. If you want to say that they are all people with eyes like torches, and minds so deep that they can disguise themselves in front of us for thousands or tens of thousands of years, unless you and I both have pig and dog brains. So I don't believe it, she said softly, then looked up at Su Yusong. I don't believe it. At least I don't believe it was their idea. The two wandering souls had always boasted of their unparalleled wisdom. They had always looked down on the elders of the Freemasonry. Although the elders were usually taciturn and aloof when they were in contact. But after many years, even the most taciturn people would occasionally speak and express their views. So the two fake saints knew what kind of people they were. They couldn't be said to be idiots. Even compared to the mortals of this world, these elders who claimed to be reincarnated celestials were actually quite quick-witted and knowledgeable. However, that was only relative to ordinary people. In front of the strong who were really good at scheming, ordinary people, very smart people, were no different from idiots. Those elders were more like a group of mortals who had accidentally obtained wealth and power, just like the useless sons of ministers in the secular world. They also knew that they made the elders feel afraid. So they lived on Little Cloud Mountain all year round, and would never set foot on the top of Cloud Mountain unless they were summoned. Because of this, they had the idea of being independent. But at this time, the rain of fire that filled the sky destroyed everything they had built up before. The timing was perfect, the power was so strong that it was impossible to resist, and the mind was extremely vicious. The elders might have such power, but they shouldn't have such thoughts. Su Yusong frowned and gritted his teeth. The thousands of cultivators in the distance seemed to be at a loss for a moment, unable to advance or retreat. In front of them were demons and behind them were the saints they could no longer trust. They should have left the battlefield immediately, but, in the distance, it was ancestral Cloud Mountain. They were hesitating but Su Yusong ignored them. After thinking for a moment he said in a low voice, So, it's Qin Zhao? Qin Zhao really didn't die? Qin Zhao sneaked into Cloud Mountain and controlled the elders? The restriction on Little Cloud Mountain was touched. Was it Qin Zhao's doing? He said so much in one breath, but Wuxia also frowned as if he was seriously considering his words. Then he said, But back then we watched Qin Zhao die. And there's been no news of her for so many years. Don't you think it's too far-fetched for her to suddenly jump out at this time? Moreover, this matter isn't her style of doing things. Su Yusong was silent, then nodded. It's indeed not her style. If it was her, how could she let us go? She must have asked Grandmaster D to order us to go to the battlefield and then catch us all in one fell swoop. Although Qin Zhao looks crazy, she's cautious in her bones. There's no reason for her to let us go. But, is it really Grandmaster D? Zhuomuxia shook his head and looked at him silently, not saying anything. Su Yusong frowned. What do you want to say? Have you ever thought? Zhuomuxia said slowly and hesitantly, have you ever thought that Li Yunxin is really dead? Su Yusong was stunned. You mean? Who else could think of such a vicious plan? Zhuomuxia looked at him. If there's a person who has such insight, doesn't care about the lives of cultivators and doesn't care about the lives of demons and can run into Cloud Mountain, who else but him? Su Yusong glared at him. Ridiculous. Let's not talk about the fact that we watched him die. What ability does he have to coerce Grandmaster D? But when he said this, he also paused. Whether Li Yunxin was really dead or not, there was indeed room for negotiation. After all, he knew one or two secret methods that they didn't know. It wasn't unreasonable to insist on such a far-fetched explanation. But the second point, he didn't have to control or coerce the elders. Li Yunxin, that evildoer. They had experienced his ability of sweet talk and bewitching people many times. Those elders. If they really met him face to face and didn't kill him with a palm strike before he spoke, they would most likely fall into his trap. They would think that he was a wise man submits to circumstances and would submit to them. This guess was much more reliable than the idea of Qin Zhao reappearing in the world. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.